Investigators race to stop a serial bomber who sends his deadly parcels by mail. 3 people have been killed, and no one knows how many more packages are en route to their targets. In California, experts match wits with a terrorist bent on crippling the Internal Revenue Service. For 5 years, his bombs have confounded authorities. Sheer luck has prevented injuries, but sheer skill is what's needed to catch him. Beneath the rubble, the terrorist leaves a calling card that experts are learning to read. In bomb investigations, forensics means the difference between feeling safe and living in terror. Fear is the terrorist's greatest ally. To achieve his ends, he doesn't care who dies. He can strike anywhere, anytime. And though his crimes are carefully plotted, their effect seems horribly random. When bombs are his weapon of choice, he can kill from a distance. In Birmingham, Alabama, 2 weeks before Christmas 1989, Helen Vance accepted a package addressed to her husband, Robert. Federal Judge Robert Vance came in from his yard work to find the package on the table where his wife was wrapping gifts. Believing it contained magazines he'd been waiting for, he cut the string and opened the box. He was killed instantly. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they tried to help Helen Vance, who was standing nearby when the bomb exploded. She was temporarily deafened from the blast and in shock, unable to speak. Forensic experts rushed to the scene to investigate. They collected nails embedded in the walls and ceiling, shards of steel pipe, and the remnants of the package itself. The explosion had hurled the shrapnel up to 3,600 miles per hour. Each fragment was carefully cataloged. Only the most meticulous work would allow authorities to catch a killer who struck from a distance. And that killer wasn't stopping. 150 miles away in Atlanta, 2 days after Judge Vance was killed, a package arrived at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, addressed to the clerk's office. A routine X-ray revealed the ominous silhouette of a pipe bomb. Before the shocked security officers could stop it, the package dropped to the floor. The officers immediately evacuated the building and called bomb technicians. An alert posted after the death of Judge Vance described the device that killed him. The Atlanta bomb resembled the one in Birmingham. Though Vance's bomb was rigged to explode when the package was opened, the bomb techs had to assume this one could blow at any moment. The drop from the conveyor belt and routine handling in the post office could have rendered it unstable. Their Kevlar suits, 3 inches thick and weighing 80 pounds, provide safety only at a distance. If the tech is close to the detonation, the pressure from the blast would crush him. The first step was to photograph and X-ray the bomb to study its components. The X-rays revealed no timing device, so the techs breathed a little easier.
I think the switch is going to be all right. We know the bomb.
There was no reason to rush. Unless a bomb is rigged to a timer or strapped to a victim, bomb removal typically takes hours. Every step was planned, every motion rehearsed. As each maneuver was carefully completed, the bomb techs paused to ventilate their smothering suits and modify their strategy. As a precaution, the area around the building was kept clear of pedestrians and traffic. Throughout the delicate operation, their hands remained uncovered to assure they kept a secure grip. Once they were certain the bomb was stable, they lowered it into a bin and put it in an armored trailer. Police cars and motorcycles cleared a safe area around the vehicle. The convoy took the least populated route to the bomb range at the city landfill. The package was rendered safe, but this second bomb in 2 days had enormous impact. It suggested a serial bomber. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms Special Agent Brian Hoback was assigned to the case.
You got to remember who the targets were. 1, a judge, a federal judge. 2, people at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals who had nothing to do with the judicial system other than administrative matters.
But the bomber wasn't through. On December 18th, the same day the Atlanta bomb was deactivated, attorney Robbie Robinson received a package in Savannah, 250 miles away. Like Judge Vance, Robinson had no reason to suspect anything sinister about the package sitting on his desk a week before Christmas. In an instant, he became the killer's second victim. Investigators mapped out the direction of the explosion to better estimate the size of the bomb. They set up a grid and began the tedious task of collecting even the tiniest shreds of evidence.
When investigators go to a crime scene, they're looking for physical evidence. That evidence in a bombing scene is everywhere. It's on the ceilings, it's on the ground, it's in the walls, it's in the furniture, it's in the victim's body, it's on the victim's clothing. First, we photograph. Then we grid the room so that we know exactly where that piece of evidence came from and we can articulate that to a jury. We got down on our hands and knees and collected that evidence, sifted it, stick it over a screen, shake the debris to see if we can't find components of whatever the device was that exploded. In that particular case, it was a pipe bomb inside of a cardboard box.
One of the more insidious aspects of the bomb was the fact that dozens of nails, seen here in X-rays of the victim's body, were packed around the pipe, increasing the deadliness of the explosion. These nails matched those from Judge Vance's bomb and the package intercepted at the courthouse in Atlanta. The wrapping, found almost intact in Robinson's trash can, was also comparable to the other bombs. With 3 bombs in 2 days, time was precious. Agent Hoback and his multi-agency team struggled to find a link between the three targets. Why would someone single out this particular lawyer, judge, and court building? The bombing seemed like random strikes against the legal system. If that were true, the bomber would be hard to predict and harder to catch. They couldn't anticipate who the next victim might be, and it was likely that the bomb was already in the mail.
His shot is peeled backwards on that.
In the lab, experts studied the nails, pieces of pipe, bits of wire, and package remnants collected from the exploded bombs. They took inventory of the most minute details. Barely perceptible markings, fragments of logos, tiny pieces of packaging, all may lead to manufacturers or retail outlets or directly to a killer. But in this case, the items surviving the blast were too generic to tell them anything. The bomber continued with his deadly plan. Fortunately, Jacksonville, Florida NAACP President Willie Dennis was too busy to open her mail on December 18th. Learning of Robinson's death in Savannah and warned by her friends to be wary of any packages, she called her secretary the next day to advise him not to open the parcel on her desk.
What she later did was call the sheriff's department down there in Jacksonville and requested them to look at a package that to her seemed somewhat suspicious.
The technicians noted it was identical to packages used in the previous bombings. They photographed and x-rayed it to see if their suspicions were justified.
You got a power supply, you got wires going into an unknown dense substance.
The x-rays disclosed a device that matched the other bombs, so investigators had the advantage of knowing what they were dealing with.
First thing we want to do is disrupt.
The technicians used a mechanical device to disable its firing system. The package had been successfully ripped apart. Still wary of an explosion, technicians carefully pulled the unexploded pipe bomb from the office while maintaining a cautious distance. It was brought to a bomb range, studied, rendered safe, and carefully dismantled. Left behind in the office were the now familiar nails and brown paper with red and white mailing labels. Like most mail bombers, this one affixed more than enough postage to assure his package was delivered. This parcel also contained something surprising, a roll of hate mail. It included a copy of a threatening letter sent to a Jacksonville television station. The postmark linked it to an Atlanta post office. So now the agents knew the bomb was probably sent from Georgia. The physical evidence was building. These strongly worded letters put right-wing fringe groups high on the list of suspects. The ATF assembled a task force to outsmart the bomber. Terry Pelfrey, a bomb technician with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, was called into the group's monthly lunch meeting.
My role in the investigation was to first look at right-wing groups that were located in Georgia. These included the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nation members, Christian Identity Church movement members, and skinheads. We had informants in each of these groups. Some of the informants ranked as high as Grand Dragons in these groups, which were the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. There was no talk within the right-wing movement groups that would give us any indication of bomb suspects in these groups.
Yesterday, you guys
At the December 19th meeting, an ATF agent outlined the similarities among the recent bombing incidents.
After considerable effort, did you see anything you recognize?
He passed around pictures of the bomb recovered at the courthouse and described what he knew of its construction.
The device consists of a pipe bomb with flat welded end plates.
The description struck a spark of recognition for ATF bomb expert Lloyd Irwin. The bombs resembled one he saw in 1972. Though he had inspected more than 3,000 bombs in his career, he had a feeling this was the work of the same bomber.
The minute I looked at it, I saw some characteristics of this bomb that reminded me of the 1972 bomb. That being that it had square end plates held with a bolt through the center. I only had one bolt, but still it was the same technique.
How about drawing me a picture?
He hadn't seen another like it in more than 15 years. From memory, Irwin sketched the 1972 bomb.
You learn that the guy, even though he changes his technique, if he's made them before, he'll keep something similar because he knows it worked before. Why trash it when he can make it work again? So he might modify it, but he'll still have some similarities of something that he's done before.
Did we get him?
Yeah.
For Irwin, the construction of the devices bore the signature of the 1972 bomber. Right after the meeting, he called Special Agent Hoback.
So Lloyd Irwin called me back at the office to advise me that he had seen only one other device like this in all the years that he had been involved in these types of investigations, and he gave me the name of the man who had been convicted of possessing that device in 1972. That man's name was Walter Leroy Moody.
Roy Moody had been convicted of building a bomb he intended to send to the man who had repossessed his car. The bomb's real victim, however, was Moody's wife, Hazel, who inadvertently opened the package, injuring her hand and eye and severely burning her face. Roy Moody went to prison, and Hazel was granted a divorce. The ATF began taking a closer look at Roy Moody.
We eliminate suspects by different things. Motive might be one way to eliminate them, whether their presence was actually in the area. There's a number of ways to eliminate suspects. However, what we were doing with other suspects by eliminating them, we could not do with Walter Leroy Moody.
At this point, most of the evidence linking Moody to the bombings was circumstantial. The investigators now had to positively link the components of the bombs to the suspected bomber. For that, they relied on the ATF Forensics Lab in Atlanta. By analyzing the chemical composition of the detonators and primers, experts determined who manufactured them. Fortunately, the company had very limited distribution in the Southeast. The manufacturer provided a list of the stores that sold their product. Meanwhile, the ATF noted further similarities between Moody's 1972 bomb and the recent ones. All used cardboard boxes, metal pipes with square end caps and a rod, flashlight batteries, and flashlight bulbs. So investigators would have more first-hand information. Specialists recreated and detonated the bombs. When powder packed inside a sealed pipe is ignited, it quickly converts from solid to gas. The resulting pressure is enormous. In an instant, the pipe bursts, sending razor-sharp fragments of steel and nails in all directions at deadly speed. Whoever built these bombs went to great lengths to maximize their destructive power. They were made for only one purpose: to kill. A behavioral profile described the killer as a white male, working and living alone or with one other person, disciplined, educated, self-structured, meticulous, and cowardly. He believed his current job was beneath him. Presented with that profile, Terry Pelfrey recognized the precise description of the man he had been investigating, Roy Moody.
Bill Hagmeyer with the FBI did the psychological profiling. He did not know Walter Leroy Moody at all. And so I sat during the meetings with Mr. Hagmeyer. He read the psychological profile that he had written up, and he wrote Mr. Moody's life story in that profile. It was really rather scary.
The weight of the combined evidence was enough to obtain a search warrant. On February 8th, investigators searched Moody's house. They uncovered law books and transcripts of Moody's 1972 bomb trial.
As we found in his transcripts during this search warrant, the highlighted areas where we matched forensically the evidence from the explosive site to the evidence that was found within his home and his workshop. All that matched in 1972, so in 1989, Mr. Moody gets smarter. He thinks he gets smarter.
But it was the clues detectives failed to find that raised their suspicions further.
We knew that Mr. Moody kept his books from school because he had his law books. However, he didn't have his chemistry books. We also did not find the weapons that apparently Mr. Moody owned. We knew he owned some because he had ammunition in the front seat of his pickup truck. So where were those weapons?
Following a lead, investigators secured permission to search the basement of a house in Chamblee, Georgia, where Moody rented storage space. They found a pipe with caps screwed onto each end. The caps had holes drilled through them, and one of the ends had a nut welded atop it, ready for a rod to be threaded through. One of the investigators on the scene was ATF Special Agent David Heitch.
All ATF agents are trained in our basic school to identify improvised explosive devices, and the most basic and most commonly used improvised explosive device in this country is a pipe bomb. And so when you see a pipe nipple with end caps affixed, I automatically think that potentially we've got a pipe bomb.
Heitch took the pipe to chemist Lloyd Irwin, who suspected Roy Moody's handiwork early in the investigation. Irwin scraped the pipe in search of explosive residue. His analysis yielded only rust. The pipe may have been a prototype, but agents had no way to prove it. They just didn't have enough to make their case. In their search for more evidence in the mail bombings, investigators went to stores that sold the brand of primers used in the bombs. Their hunt led them to the Shootin' Iron gun shop in Griffin, Georgia. An employee remembered selling a 4-pound keg of Red Dot smokeless powder and 4,000 handgun primers in December of 1989. The large purchase stuck in his mind. Red Dot was the powder used in the December bombs, and 3,200 primers were needed to fire them. In a photo lineup, the clerk chose Roy Moody as the customer. Investigators felt they had their man. On July 10, 1990, Roy Moody was arrested and held without bail. Police also brought into custody his wife, Susan, as a possible accomplice. She was permitted a bond. Susan Moody was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of conspiracy in exchange for her complete cooperation. She told investigators how she had been a servant to Roy almost since the day they met in 1981. She said Roy taught her to cover her trail, use disguises, buy materials, and mail packages far from home. She also offered the name of Roy's former cellmate. When investigators searched his house, they found footlockers with Moody's name on them. They contained the missing guns and chemistry books. Agents also found ammunition, a bomb diagram, and an arc welding unit. Susan Moody's testimony was crucial to cracking the case.
She pretty much put everything together for us. We had bits and pieces all throughout the investigation of why Moody did this, how he did this, to what extent he did the bombings the same way that he did in 1972 as far as their construction. However, Mrs. Moody actually told us how he went about the process and how the process began with the motive.
And what was that motive? Roy Moody had a history of frivolous litigation. Most of his cases were thrown out of court. He was desperate to become a lawyer so he could fix what he considered to be a flawed system. But he was denied the bar exam because of his 1972 felony conviction for creating the bomb that injured his first wife. When he failed to have the conviction overturned, Moody swore revenge against the judicial system. He started with Judge Robert Vance, who had written an opinion denying his appeal. Moody was caught through dedicated investigative work, detailed forensics, and the sharp memory of bomb investigator Lloyd Irwin.
We have a computer system at ATF that matches up bomb components, and it's a very valuable computer system, and we're continuously refining that computer system. It's amazing what it can do. You can enter the components you have from a device, and it will tell you if there have ever been any similar devices constructed. Well, in this particular case, Lloyd beat the computer, and there's no substitute for experience like Lloyd has.
The legal system that Roy Moody felt had failed him did not fail the citizens he terrorized. In June 1991, the jury sentenced him to 7 life terms plus 400 years, later changed to the death penalty. Moody's twisted agenda relied on the U.S. mail to deliver his bombs to specific people. But other terrorists are not so particular about who they murder. The Oklahoma City bombing was thought to be a strike against government. In the process of destroying the building, 168 citizens were killed. When a terrorist targets the government, there's no predicting how or when he'll attack. In the early morning hours of February 22, 1990, the West Los Angeles Fire Department answered a routine call to douse a burning truck around the corner from their station. But this was no standard vehicle fire. The truck, parked in front of an office building, contained 5 55-gallon barrels and clusters of pipes in its bed, all tilted toward the building. The pipes were improvised mortars designed to lob pipe bombs. Some had already launched. To keep the barrels from rupturing, firefighters used gentle pressure to cool them and extinguish the fire. Bomb technicians were called in. Members of the Los Angeles Police Department bomb squad rushed to the scene. As they suited up, firefighters explained what they had found. bomb squad detective Joe Powell realized that a huge catastrophe was narrowly averted.
The fire department described that the drums were cherry red hot because of the fire, and they put the fire out with the water hose that they normally use. The fire department was extremely lucky that the device did not detonate on them when they were putting the fire out.
Powell's primary concern was to be sure there were no secondary devices, so he checked the 5th floor, where windows had been broken by the homemade mortar rounds. The bombs penetrated the office of the IRS, which occupied the 5th floor, but damage was minimal. Then he and his partner cautiously approached the truck. They needed to determine whether the truck was booby-trapped, since their first priority is to keep people from getting hurt.
Once the area was evacuated, we went up and took individual samples out of each drum, analyzed them at the scene visually, and then sent them back to the lab for a scientific evaluation to see what the chemical structure was.
The contents of the barrels were sent to the lab. Using a gas chromatograph, the samples were broken down into their chemical components. The tests determined that the substance inside the barrels was ANFO, an unstable mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. The truck contained more than 200 gallons of ANFO. To understand the destructive potential of that much explosive, the LAPD performed a test explosion in the California desert. They filled a pickup truck with a combination of ANFO and TNT to simulate the conditions at the IRS building. The truck had been obliterated. Wreckage littered the desert floor. Nothing recognizable was left behind. In an urban setting, the damage from such an explosion would have been colossal, says FBI Special Agent Nick Boone.
That is almost the equivalent of 1,600 pounds of TNT. This is a high explosive. The blast would have gone out in all directions and done extreme damage for many blocks. The only thing that would have made it more devastating is had this same truck been confined as if in the parking garage, the effect would have been something like Oklahoma City.
In fact, the parking garage was the scene of a potential bombing less than 2 years earlier. In that case, too, disaster was narrowly averted. The IRS building had been the target of bombings before. In September 1988, the basement parking garage was the scene of the first incident. Detective Powell and the bomb squad disarmed a 1971 Toyota at this address. It contained a water heater filled with ANFO. It also had a booby trap under the rear tire. When tripped, the car burst into flames. As the fire department extinguished it, they found pipe bombs in the trunk. Bomb squad technicians determined that gasoline cans and plastic detergent bottles in the back seat were filled with ammonia and bleach. They were designed to fill the garage with poisonous fumes. The bombs were deactivated without incident. The car had been reported stolen from the parking lot of Ford Aerospace, but there the trail grew cold. But not for long. 6 months later, a routine line check by the power company uncovered pipe bombs attached to 4 high-voltage power poles behind the same building. the bombs detonated, causing minor damage. The IRS building in West LA wasn't the bomber's only target. The power line bombs resembled one found 8 months earlier, about 50 miles away. An electronic detonator and ANFO were attached to the base of a power pole servicing the IRS building in Laguna Niguel, California. It was rendered harmless by the bomb squad. It was clear the bombings were related. These attacks and bombings in other buildings dating back to 1986 led to the formation of a multi-agency task force on terrorism. It found that the circuitry in all the bombs was similar. FBI Special Agent Frank Bhakti was a case agent for the task force.
All explosive devices, especially serial bomber explosive devices, have a specific signature or type of construction unique to the bomb maker. And if you could examine a series of unexplained bombings, you can examine the way the bombs are put together and make a fairly educated guess as to whether one person might be responsible based upon the way the bombs are constructed.
Besides the design similarities, all the bombings shared a common target, the Internal Revenue Service.
We began investigating in several directions. One was to try and find other similar bombings that were committed in this area and to see who was either convicted of those bombings or suspected. We also went in the direction of states' rights, anti-government, anti-IRS groups, because they would logically be the kind of people that might attack the buildings and go after IRS.
A potential lead arrived in the mail. In letters sent to the newspaper and to the IRS building, a group calling itself Up the IRS Incorporated claimed responsibility for the truck bombing, as it had the 1988 car bomb attack. Boone considered the letter authentic, as it contained information about the bomb not made public. The envelopes were addressed by hand, giving investigators a writing sample, but they had nothing to compare it against. A more immediately helpful clue was a digital watch used as a timing device. Investigators believed the bomber was trying to show off his high-tech skills, but to no avail. The alarm on the watch used to ignite the truck bomb wasn't set properly, so the device didn't detonate as planned. Even so, the circuitry of the bombs provided the first clear lead. Many components were built exclusively for the military and were unavailable on the street. That suggested the bomber had some contact with the high-tech industry. The fact that the car used in the garage bombing in 1988 was stolen from the parking lot at Ford Aerospace gave LAPD Detective Bob Nelson an avenue to pursue.
We learned later on in the investigation, as we went through the components, that there were certain identifiable wires and electronic components that were directly attributed to the Ford Aerospace location. However, there was no estimate as to when they were actually utilized. There was no date or any way to tell if it was an old surplus item or something current.
Nelson and Boone were certain the bomber was a past or present employee of Ford Aerospace. But the company employs thousands. The detectives had no way of narrowing the pool. Thanks to the swift action of the West Los Angeles Fire Department, one of the most pivotal clues was preserved. The serial number from the truck used in the 1990 bombing was traced to its last registered owners. Mr. and Mrs. Orozco had sold it for $500 in December of 1989.
Okay, does it run?
According to Mr. Orozco, the buyer hardly spoke, asked few questions, and seemed anxious to leave. He didn't haggle over the price, and he paid cash. The name he signed on the title form was James T. Harmon. Police knew that if they found Harmon, they'd find the bomber. But what did he look like? A police artist brought an identikit to the Orozcos to create a composite sketch.
Oh yeah. It was.
There was some balding going on.
It contains hundreds of overlays of generic facial features.
The style, straight.
By mixing and matching, the artist slowly fashioned a likeness of the suspect that the witnesses were satisfied with. An initial check with FBI, ATF, and LAPD files came up empty. In the meantime, the bomber struck again. On the morning of March 31st, 1991, mortar fire buffeted the parking lot and roof of the IRS Service Center in Fresno, California. No one was hurt. The 13 missiles were launched from a vacant lot, where investigators collected extension cords, wiring, and crumpled newspaper used as packing. They also picked up a digital watch timing device and aerospace circuitry. Agent Boone knew the same bomber was responsible, and he knew he and Detective Nelson were getting closer to catching him.
I took one look at it, saw many of our components, and knew this is our bomber again. This is our serial bomber. But this time he slipped up, and we got the major break of the case. One of those components was what we call a heat sink. It's simply a piece of metal that disperses heat.
Boone believed the specialized component was probably made by Ford Aerospace. He needed to learn more about it, but everyone at the plant was a potential suspect. Who could he trust? Discreet inquiries about the component brought him nothing. Frustrated, getting nowhere, he showed it to the assembly engineer, taking the chance he wasn't the bomber.
He walked down one corridor, turned the corner, walked down another, reached into a bin, and handed me an identical heat sink. I can't tell you what the feeling was like at that point. It was the most exciting part of the case ever, and I also began to look around quite concerned that I'm now standing here with the heat sink in my hand, and there's every possibility that the bomber is 2 tables away, is on the assembly line, is the engineer around the corner. We got out of there about as fast as we could get away from the assembly line and back off the floor.
Although identifying numbers had been filed off, the components were ringed with red paint. The engineer explained that meant they were defective and pulled off the line. This considerably narrowed down the possible areas at Ford Aerospace.
Only 84 of them were ever manufactured, and 9 of them only had been pulled off the line as defective. So now we really had 4 of 9 in the entire world.
Hello, sir. Thanks for seeing us.
Investigators brought the composite sketch to the manager of the engineering lab, the most likely source of the heat sink. The manager didn't recognize the face and didn't know a James Harmon. Who was this man? Detectives knew they were getting close, but the identity of their bomber still eluded them. How soon before he struck again? How soon before he killed someone? As their search for the bomber continued, Agent Boone and Detective Nelson received a call from the lab manager. After thinking about it, he did in fact recognize the face in the police sketch. It bore a resemblance to an engineer in the large-scale inspection lab. It looked like a man named Dean Harvey Hicks. The investigators raced back to Ford Aerospace. At his desk, they found anti-IRS cartoons, and in his employee file were writing samples that matched the handwriting on the envelopes of the letters that claimed responsibility.
Once we reached a part of the investigation where we were at Ford Aerospace, and Nick Boone pulled open the personnel file and made the comparison with the photograph and the handprinting and handwriting, we knew that Dean Harvey Hicks was our suspect.
Digging deeper, agents learned that on January 17, 1990, a man named James T. Harmon purchased 700 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, the main ingredient of ANFO, at the Orange County Farm Supply Company. James T. Harmon was the name on the DMV form submitted after the purchase of the truck used in the 1990 bombing. The handwriting on the receipt matched that of Dean Harvey Hicks. Incriminating handwriting was also found at the scene of the Fresno bombing, placing Hicks at the scene.
He had figured on some newspaper how far his mortar bombs would fire, how much powder would send the bomb how far, and he had worked this out on this piece of newspaper. He then wadded that up and actually used it for packing in the Fresno device. We had that also. When we straightened that out and were able to look at the numbers on a flat surface, we were able to actually also match those to his handwriting.
Agent Boone and Detective Nelson tallied the evidence. Hicks had been off work when each of the bombs was planted. He had access to all of the items linked to Ford Aerospace. He matched the description of the purchaser of the truck used in 1990, and his handwriting matched the letters claiming responsibility. But detectives didn't know if he was acting alone. Before they arrested him, they kept an eye on him.
Surveillance continued while the arrest warrant and search warrants were being prepared, while we looked into his past to determine whether or not there was other people involved with him. At a point in the investigation, we believed that there may be some interest in him constructing another device. We initiated the search warrant and the arrest warrant the following day.
His arrest came on July 11, 1991. Hicks was brought to a hotel room for interview. There, he seemed pleased to provide details about the bombings. He especially liked to answer technical questions the investigators could not figure out.
By the time we had finished the interview, Dean Hicks had made a complete confession and described to us in great detail how he put together and delivered most of the bombs. He actually had some loss of recollection on some of them because it was just too long ago, but he was incredibly detailed on all of the more recent bombings, how he meticulously put them together and how he constructed them and how he delivered them to the site.
While Boone and Nelson interviewed Hicks, forensics experts searched his house and garage. There, they found bombs in progress, circuits, ammonium nitrate, and false ID bearing the name of James T. Harmon. The story became very clear. His co-workers at Ford Aerospace knew that Dean Harvey Hicks despised the IRS. But they didn't know he was stealing parts from the workplace in order to attack the government agency. In 1981, Hicks had claimed an $8,500 income tax deduction, a contribution to an organization that the IRS did not consider nonprofit. It denied the deduction. Hicks claimed that the IRS employee he spoke with laughed at him, so he used his electronics expertise to exact his revenge. Though he claimed to be part of a group, the Task Force on Terrorism determined that Hicks acted alone.
Organized groups are not always responsible for acts of domestic terrorism. One person can do just as much damage with a little bit of explosive knowledge as an entire terrorist organization. And I think in the past, we would always tend to look at the organized terrorist organizations being responsible for some of the acts. I think Mr. Hicks has shown everyone that one person acting alone can be just as deadly and just as dangerous as a large group.
As clever as Dean Harvey Hicks was, the tireless efforts of investigators like Agent Nick Boone and Detective Bob Nelson finally ended his reign of terror. Finding him guilty on 4 counts of using destructive devices against a federal facility, a jury sentenced Hicks to 20 years in prison. Ironically, he was also ordered to pay more than $335,000 to the Internal Revenue Service. The crimes of Dean Hicks and Roy Moody were personal vendettas disguised as political statements. Like all acts of terrorism, the senseless deeds of these desperate men accomplished nothing. Despite its mystique, terrorism is a crime like any other. And like all crimes, the perpetrator can't help but leave clues behind. With each new case, forensic detectives refine their ability to trace those clues back to the criminal. A Cleveland woman is killed in her home. Can 40-year-old evidence absolve a dead man of guilt? A stormy argument ends with a gunshot. To investigators, the situation screams murder, until years later, when forensics throws new light on it. 2 homicides, 1 suspect. But the evidence needed to make the case was buried long ago. Will an exhumation put the final nail in the killer's coffin? At a murder scene, police must wring the full meaning from every available clue. But when the evidence is inadequate, detectives must return to the victim to make their grave discoveries. In 1998, a breakthrough in DNA analysis helped solve a 40-year-old murder case. At sunrise on the morning of July 4th, 1954, Dr. Sam Shepard slowly came to on the Bay Village, Ohio shore of Lake Erie. The events of the pre-dawn hours flooded back to him like a nightmare. Fearing the worst, he staggered into the lakefront home he shared with his wife Marilyn and their young son, Sam. There, in the bedroom, his wife lay brutally beaten to death. She had been 4 months pregnant. Dr. Shepard told police he was awakened on the downstairs couch by his wife's panicked cries. When Shepard rushed to help her, he was attacked by a tall intruder. The resulting fistfight ranged from room to room and ultimately spilled onto the beach. There, the doctor was dealt a knockout blow to the neck. A bag of the Shepard's jewelry was found near the house, suggesting that the couple had interrupted a burglary. But the police work was soon overshadowed by rampant speculation. In the rush to justice, the shadowy intruder was forgotten. Sam Shepard became the only suspect. But a few people refused to believe Shepard was guilty and were determined to prove his innocence decades later. In the early 1990s, Cleveland attorney Terry Gilbert began studying the case and felt that Shepard was railroaded by a cursory look at the evidence.
Dr. Sam Gerber, the coroner, had concluded within an hour or two after being at the crime scene that they had their man and it was Dr. Shepard. It was a death by domestic homicide.
A trail of nearly 60 drops of blood led through the house. These were checked to ascertain they were human, but nothing more could be done with them. Forensic DNA analysis was 30 years away. Some of the bloodstains on the cellar stairs were overlooked for decades. Since Dr. Shepard had no open wounds, police assumed this blood trail fell from the murder weapon clutched in his hand. Forced entry marks on the door to the basement were never entered as evidence. Despite obvious signs an intruder had penetrated the house, Dr. Shepard was arrested for killing his wife. The coroner staged a public inquest. Dr. Shepard was grilled on live television for 5 hours without his attorney.
The media grabbed hold of it and sensationalized this murder. The Cleveland Press, through editor Louis Seltzer, every day ran articles about solving the Shepard case. Why is Dr. Shepard not indicted? Why is he not in jail? Cartoons showing him running through the house with some kind of a murder weapon dripping blood.
Local officials hurried to close the high-profile case. The trial began just 2 months after Shepard's arrest. The coroner testified that the blood found throughout the house was human. It was assumed that it came from the victim. The prosecution argued that the doctor had faked his own neck injury. The jewelry bag was also presented as phony evidence of burglary.
It was just a complete travesty of justice in terms of how that trial emerged during that time. And he was convicted. It was a foregone conclusion. He did not have a chance.
We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled and sworn, do find the defendant, Sam H. Shepard, not guilty of murder in the first degree, but guilty of murder in the second degree.
Dr. Shepard was sentenced to 35 years in prison. But his family challenged the verdict, refusing to give up. A month after the conviction, they brought in forensic expert Leland Kirk to examine the blood spatters in the house. His analysis of several stains in the bedroom undermined the state's argument. 2 blood stains larger than the spatters in the bedroom stood out to investigators. Their size and round shape suggested a puncture wound. The victim may have bitten her attacker. In Kirk's view, evidence strongly indicated a third person was at the scene. But the court wouldn't hear a word of it. In 1959, 5 years after the murder, the case took a strange twist.
Just hold it closer to your chest. Thank you. Look into the camera.
Cleveland handyman Richard Eberling was arrested for robbing a home where he worked. And police found among his spoils one of Marilyn Shepard's diamond rings. At his interrogation, Eberling, who resembled the man Shepard and witnesses described, unwittingly volunteered some incriminating information. He said he had cut himself at the Shepard's house the week of the murder, which would explain any strange blood found there. But he couldn't have known that investigators had questioned the bloodstains. It sounded like a killer's alibi. Even so, the county prosecutor refused to look at this new evidence. On July 16, 1964, a federal district court ruled that Shepard was denied a fair trial. After serving 10 years in prison, he was released and granted a retrial. Evidence that was ignored, misread, or suppressed would finally be seen. For his second trial in 1966, 2 years after his release, Dr. Shepard had rising legal star F. Lee Bailey handling his defense.
Well, how do you explain his conviction in the first place? It was a result, according to Judge Weinman, and in my opinion, of mass hysteria generated by an overzealous press. Were you in on the case at the beginning? No, I've only been a lawyer for 4 years. He's been in jail for 10.
Bailey eroded the prosecution's case point by point. After years of neglect, the forced entry marks on the cellar door were entered as evidence. Bailey also argued that traces of a possible intruder were lost when the victim's body was prematurely washed by the coroner. Finally, a doctor testified that the fractured vertebra in Shepard's neck could not have been self-inflicted. 12 years after the murder, the focus of the case switched to the mysterious intruder. In the retrial of convicted killer Sam Shepard, the discoveries of forensic expert Leland Kirk were finally going to be heard. Kirk testified that one blood drop on the closet door came from a puncture wound. The victim had died of blunt trauma, ruling her out as the source of the stain. But a re-examination of the autopsy record showed that her teeth had all the signs of inflicting a single powerful bite just before she died. Dr. Shepard showed no such wound. After a dozen years, the phantom attacker was taking on human form. Kirk's road to the truth was a trail of blood.
Any forensic scientist, even then, would have told you that blood, as soon as it hits the air, dries and coagulates.
The blood could not have dripped from a weapon long enough to have made the trail.
These were all of equal size, which indicates that it came from an oozing wound. And none of this was looked into in 1954.
Though the victim was forever silenced, the evidence was speaking out. The second trial lasted 3 weeks. F. Lee Bailey had stirred a reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. On November 16, 1966, Sam Shepard was acquitted of killing his wife. But no one reopened the investigation into who had committed the murder. Potential suspects like Richard Eberling continued to be ignored. There was one reason. Many still felt Shepard was the killer, but that he'd been released on technicalities. Though the bloodstains gave him his freedom, they still smeared his reputation. He couldn't revive his medical practice. Just 6 years after his release, and after a failed second marriage, Dr. Shepard died of the effects of alcoholism. Through all the turmoil, Dr. Shepard's surviving son, Sam, lived quietly out of the spotlight. But in 1989, Richard Eberling, the Cleveland handyman and burglar, wrote to him from prison. Eberling was jailed for forging a woman's will and then beating her to death for the $1 million inheritance. Sam met with Eberling. The convict shared little-known facts about the Shepard case. Sam wanted another trial to prove that Eberling was Marilyn Shepard's killer. At this point, Terry Gilbert sued the state of Ohio for Dr. Shepard's wrongful imprisonment. After his release, Shepard had sought no damages for the loss of his freedom. 40 years after the crime, his family hoped to prove the doctor's innocence by unlocking the secrets hidden in a drop of blood. The bloodstain evidence was passed to Dr. Mohammed Tahir, DNA analyst at the Indianapolis Marion County Forensic Services Agency.
And the actual challenge was not the DNA analysis, because this work we do every day. And the only challenge in this case was because the evidence was very minimum, very old.
For comparison, Dr. Tahir needed a standard DNA profile from both the victim and Dr. Shepard. This way, if he found a third genetic profile in the decades-old bloodstains, he would know it belonged to the intruder. Dr. Tahir found a clean DNA profile for the victim in hairs plucked from her deathbed 40 years before. Though Shepard had died 18 years after his wife, a sample of his DNA seemed as elusive as the killer. Without this forensic key, the case to clear Dr. Shepard's name was stalled. Then the doctor's son thought he had a first-class source of his father's genetic material. He presented some love letters that his father had sent his mother when they were courting in 1943. Dr. Shepard's DNA might still be in the saliva mixed with the glue on the envelopes and stamps. But over the decades, the envelopes had been handled by too many people. Any DNA found on them was tainted and unusable. Once again, the case bogged down. There was still one place left to search for the doctor's DNA: his grave. Hounded in life, even death could offer Shepard no peace. In 1996, an order for his exhumation was granted. On the headstone were the letters VQP, standing for the Latin meaning, "He who endures, conquers." Perhaps after nearly half a century, Dr. Shepard would finally be vindicated. Dr. Tahir was able to extract a completely clean DNA profile from one of Shepard's teeth after 24 years in the grave. But for comparison, he needed evidence taken from the crime scene. Dr. Tahir performed DNA tests on the bloody pants Shepard had worn the night of the murder. While he waited for those results, he processed two other vital clues. The first was the mysterious blood drop that Dr. Kirk had collected from the closet door back in 1955. The second was a blood-stained wood chip Sam had salvaged from a cellar stair tread before his childhood home was torn down in 1993. The results of Dr. Tahir's analysis became the new backbone of the case. There was a third person's DNA in the stains, not Dr. Shepard's and not the victim's. The mysterious intruder was no longer a product of Shepard's imagination. He was flesh and blood. But who was the third man? Attorney Terry Gilbert thought he knew where to begin his search. The imprisoned Richard Eberling was required to give a sample of his blood for comparison. Dr. Tahir found that the convict's DNA could not be excluded from the bloodstain on the wood chip or on the pants. The test results were 16,000 to 1 in favor that the strange bloodstain in the house was Eberling's, but those odds weren't good enough. The courts require a certainty of millions to 1 for a conviction. And when Eberling heard his DNA was linked to the bloody stair, he reminded investigators of his alibi, that he had cut his hand at the Shepard's home shortly before the murder. 40 years after the fact, Eberling knew there was no one to dispute his story. Because the DNA evidence was inconclusive, the truth about the murder might never come out. Time was conspiring to hide the killer's name. Many people involved in the case had long since died. A private detective agency volunteered to locate any surviving witnesses. After months of searching, they found Vern Lund and Ed Wilbert, two other Cleveland handymen who had known Richard Eberling. They remembered that Marilyn Shepard had once caught Eberling robbing her home. When the victim was murdered, they knew Eberling had the motive. And this prompted one more recollection. Eberling was out sick the week before the murder. He could not have bled at the Shepard's house as he claimed. Eberling's alibi was shattered. When all the evidence was held up to the light, the events of that tragic night so long ago came into focus. The victim screamed when she found an intruder in her room. Dr. Shepard rushed to her aid, but was knocked unconscious. The intruder tried to finish ransacking the house, bleeding from a wound all the while. When Shepard accosted the killer again, the fight carried on to the beach. There, the doctor was struck so hard, a vertebra was fractured. But broken bones mean little compared to broken lives. It took forensic science 42 years to put the pieces back together.
The forensic evidence that we uncovered in '96 was approximately 100 pieces of evidence. It excludes Dr. Shepard as the attacker and points to a very likely suspect named Richard Eberling. Eberling has denied that he's the killer, but in interviews over and over again, he has said things about the case that only the murderer would say. And this is an open case. It's still unsolved, technically.
With each new clue, Eberling's shadow cast a longer pall over the case. But he died in July 1998, keeping his secrets forever. Forensic evidence is only as revealing as the experts who study it. The positive identity of Marilyn Shepard's killer remains a mystery. But thanks to a clear-eyed look at the clues, at least Dr. Shepard was able to convince his son of his innocence from beyond the grave. Assumptions at the crime scene can shape or distort an investigation. To clear a suspect, investigators must first believe he's innocent and then prove it scientifically. On July 6, 1984, the Platte County, Wyoming Sheriff's Office received a frantic call from Martin Frias. In a mix of Spanish and English, he told police that there had been a shooting. He could not give clear directions to the scene. Since Frias and the officers both knew a certain cafe in neighboring Wheatland, they met there. Frias guided officers to the trailer he shared with his girlfriend, Ernestine Perea. A grim scene awaited them inside. Perea's body lay face up on the floor. She had a wound in her abdomen. Frias's .300 Magnum rifle lay close beside her. Police found 2 bullet fragments lodged in the blood-spattered wall behind the body. Frias said he'd heard a muffled thump before he went to bed. Thinking it was merely Perea hurling shoes in one of her temper tantrums, he went to sleep. Hours later, when Frias awoke, he discovered the truth. His stormy relationship was over. Suicide was the initial ruling. After detectives interviewed Frias, he was released. Then a coroner examined the victim's remains more closely. The bullet wound in the lumbar region was small, like an entry wound. Police felt it was impossible for the victim to shoot herself in the back with a rifle. All the clues now pointed to homicide. But not everyone was convinced that Frias was a murderer. Four days after the death of Ernestine Perea, Martin Frias was arrested and charged with his girlfriend's murder. Frias's attorney, Robert Moxley, believed in his client's innocence from the beginning.
When she was killed and they didn't have the scenario of her being shot in the back pat in their minds yet, they turned him loose. He had no real ties to the community. He'd been there a long time, but he was an illegal alien from Mexico. He didn't leave. He could have just disappeared and never been seen again.
But at trial, the state's forensic evidence was more compelling than Frias's cooperation with police. It even outweighed the fact that though Frias had a severely injured arm, he had somehow managed to load, cock, and fire an unwieldy weapon that required two good hands. And given Frias's injury, the victim could have defended herself. But none of this mattered at the trial. According to the state's forensic tests, the victim's blouse showed no gunshot residue. Clearly, she had been shot from a distance. A medical examiner confirmed that the clean-edged wound in the victim's back marked where the fatal bullet had struck her. According to the medical examiner, the bullet had then passed through her body, fragmented, and exited her abdomen, leaving a much larger wound with uneven edges. To police, the conclusion was obvious.
And so it was a circumstantial evidence case. If she was shot in the back, and if he was there, if his fingerprints were on the gun, well, then they could make a case that he had done it.
The jury agreed. Martin Frias was convicted of the second-degree murder of Ernestine Perea. He was sentenced to 25 to 35 years in prison. Moxley appealed the verdict. He believed the forensic evidence had not been fairly explored. Wyoming law had not allowed him to call his own experts in the case. He'd had to use the same experts as the prosecution.
At the time, the public defenders were required to rely on the state crime lab to be their neutral expert, while they were still the neutral expert, quote unquote, that was making the prosecution case for the prosecution.
Moxley felt this biased the analysis of the evidence against the defendant. Over the next year and a half, he and his assistant, Walter Carroll, fought their way through the courts to have Martin Frias retried. In order to make the case for retrial, Moxley brought on the best experts in the business. He had the victim's wound evidence re-examined by Dr. Vincent DeMaio, the chief medical examiner of Bexar County, Texas.
Dr. DeMaio was the foremost expert on high-velocity rifle gunshot wounds. And I found out that he was going to be lecturing in Cheyenne. So I jumped in my car and went to his hotel in Cheyenne and cornered him with these autopsy photos. He took really one look at those autopsy photos. He held them out like this, and he held them up to his nose, and he says, "That's a contact wound." And that's about how long it took him to know that that's what we had.
A contact wound results when a gun is fired with the muzzle pressed against the target. Dr. DeMaio's impromptu analysis of the photo bucked the state's evidence in the first trial. But to an expert, the explanation was simple.
When the hot gases are propelling a bullet down the barrel of a gun, it is compressing the air in front of it. The last few inches of the bullet's travel outside the barrel is preceded by this air, which is compressed so hard that it's like a knife, and it goes in first, then the bullet goes in, then liters and liters and liters and liters of hot gas follow the bullet.
This hot gas had violently expanded the victim's abdominal cavity to the point of tearing her jeans and snapping off the top pants button. The state's original view of the evidence was backwards. The bullet first struck the abdomen, not the back. Though it was still possible the victim had been murdered, a contact wound in her front recalled the original scenario. Ernestine Perea could have taken her own life. But only new tests would confirm this radical take on old evidence. The victim's remains had long since been buried, but police still had her autopsy x-rays and the blouse she'd worn when she died. When DeMaio's findings were presented to the Wyoming Supreme Court, the case was reopened. Martin Frias was granted a retrial. In preparation for the new trial, along with DeMaio, Moxley brought in Robert Lantz, director of the Rocky Mountain Instrumental Laboratories in Fort Collins, Colorado, to examine the case.
Mr. Moxley had asked me for my opinion, too, as far as whether or not it was at all likely that the bullet had come into her backbone from the front or from the back. After all, it's impossible to shoot yourself in the back, or at least very difficult. And so he first asked me that. I looked at the x-rays and said, this simply doesn't seem right.
But no side view x-rays of the victim's torso had been taken in the original autopsy, and Lance couldn't conclusively tell from frontal x-rays which direction the bullet had traveled. For now, he had to focus on the blouse. With a stereo light microscope, Lance observed that the fabric around the bullet hole in the front of the blouse was scorched and melted. This indicated a point-blank discharge of the weapon, but from the front, not the back. Next, Lance studied the gunshot residue on the blouse. Its distribution would tell him whether or not the gun was fired at close range. When the muzzle is close to the target, the residue saturates a very small area. At longer range, the residue area expands, but starts to thin out.
I tested the overall cloth using what's called rhodazonic acid. The rhodazonic acid is very useful to give me a pattern of the gunshot residue so that I can make an estimate of what the firing distance was and to see whether or not there is more gunshot residue on the front of the shirt or on the back of the shirt.
He placed acid-treated paper over the inside and outside of the large bullet hole in the front of the blouse. The hot iron made the acid turn any gunshot residue on the paper bright purple. The prosecution in the first trial had claimed the victim was shot at a distance. To Dr. Lance, the evidence told a different story.
And this shows us very easily the pattern so that we could see that there was a great deal of gunshot residue in a very tight mark around the hole and relatively little even a short distance away.
Once again, the forensic evidence pointed to a very close range shooting. If the victim had been shot from the front, she had seen death's approach. The question remained whether she'd welcomed it. In the retrial of Martin Frias, forensic gunshot analyst Robert Lance was wiping the defendant's slate clean with the victim's own blouse. But more rigorous tests were still needed to confirm that the victim was shot from the front. No ordinary microscope would be up to the task. To find the truth, Lance placed samples of the blouse in a scanning electron microscope to analyze the gunshot residue more closely. He discovered that the concentration of the residue decreased as the microscope panned from the front of the blouse to the back. That suggested a frontal entrance wound. The new defense was almost ready. But Moxley wanted to build the strongest case possible for his client's second trial. A blood spatter expert proved that Perea was seated on the floor when she was struck from the front.
Of the wall where the blood splatters were.
A ballistics test proved that the slug had expended its energy before striking the spine, breaking up, and exiting the body, again suggesting front entry. Medical records showed that the victim had been hospitalized for attempted suicide several times in the past. And Perea's fingerprints on the gun were oriented as if she'd held it upside down, thus bringing the trigger within reach. The new evidence was strong, but Moxley was determined to add the victim's own testimony to the new trial.
We got the family's permission to exhume the body, and we did another autopsy. We had Dr. Eckert come to participate in the autopsy, and for the first time they did lateral x-rays. The original pathologist had not done x-rays except from the front, and you couldn't tell the bullet direction from the x-rays.
The side x-rays showed bullet fragments and fragments of vertebrae that had been pushed between the victim's spine and the skin of her back. Only a bullet speeding through from the front could have left this kind of damage in its wake. When all the parts of the puzzle were fitted together, a picture of the victim's last night became clear. After an argument with his girlfriend, Martin Frias fell asleep in another room. Anger, depression, and a high blood alcohol level drove Ernestine Perea to make a final suicide attempt. She sat on the floor with the rifle resting on her extended legs. But the instant her troubles ended was the very moment her boyfriend's nightmare began.
We convincingly proved just exactly how Ernestine committed suicide. We showed the pathology evidence, we showed the blood splatter evidence, we showed the gunshot residue evidence. There weren't any questions to be answered by the time we were done with our forensic evidence.
Open door, please.
Ultimately, the new X-ray evidence from the victim's grave clinched the case. In Martin Frias' second trial, the jury needed only an hour and 45 minutes to find him not guilty. After serving 2 years and 10 days in prison for a crime he didn't commit, he was finally set free. Exhumations are an investigator's last resort. The forensic evidence taken from the grave can either acquit or convict. On the rainy night of October 19, 1983, a couple driving on a lonely road in St. Charles County, Missouri, were the first on the scene of a single vehicle accident. The car was abandoned, but the engine was still running. When the Good Samaritan tried to turn the car off, he found blood smears on the seat. Then he saw a woman lying in the shadows beneath the dashboard. She was barely breathing. Police from the St. Charles County Sheriff's Department noted the heavy odor of gasoline throughout the car. The threat of fire made them hurry to pull the victim to safety. When the woman's blonde wig slipped to one side, rescuers saw just how badly she was hurt. Detective Ed Copeland feared for her life.
At that point, while I was down in the car, I could feel that the back of her head had trauma to it, or it just didn't feel right, like a skull should feel.
As the woman was rushed to the hospital, the car's registration was traced. It belonged to Jim Williams, a successful electrical contractor. Police phoned Williams, then drove to his home to inform him of his wife's accident. They found him sitting in the rain waiting for them. At the hospital, doctors told Williams and his youngest son that Sharon wouldn't survive her massive head injuries. Jim Williams signed the forms allowing his wife's removal from life support. She died later that day. Jim's friend, Joanne Notice, tried to console him. Then, 3 months after the accident, their roles were reversed when her own marriage hit the rocks. After a bitter quarrel, Joanne's husband, Walter Notice, a band singer, stormed out into the cold December night wearing only a blue warm-up suit. Hours passed, but he didn't come home. Joanne Notice told police he'd run off. She suspected he was having an affair. But Captain Wes Simcox of the St. Charles County Sheriff's Department said Walter Notice's absence didn't seem planned.
It was extremely bad weather. It was very cold. There was snow on the ground. Walter was not dressed for that type of weather, and she was concerned about his well-being.
Walter Notice didn't return that night. The next day, Joanne Notice and Jim Williams broke into her husband's briefcase, seeking clues to his whereabouts.
Oh my golly, look at these pictures.
Joanne Notice's suspicions were confirmed in living color. The briefcase held steamy photos of her husband in the arms of his backup singer. A group of friends was organized to search for Walter. Jim Williams volunteered to scout the parking lots at the airport. There, he found Walter's car. He drove it back to the Notice house before he told police of the discovery. Joanne Notice was disturbed, and so was any trace evidence that might have been left in the vehicle. Though police appreciated Jim Williams' zeal, they were also suspicious of it. Captain Simcox felt that Jim Williams' kindness to the missing man's wife seemed to overreach the bounds of friendship.
The evening after Walter's disappearance, Jim stayed at Walter's home with Joanne. That's something you just do not do, friend or not. There were several other things where there had been relationships between Jim and Joanne, neighbors saying that they'd had what appeared to be a love affair going.
Defying the ugly rumors, Williams continued to aid his friend in her time of trouble. He helped her search the truck the band toured in. If Walter Notice had deserted his wife, she'd need bank records or securities he might have stashed there. But in the search for money, Joanne came up empty-handed. In the search for Walter, the police had no better luck. New Year's Eve came and went, with Walter Notice missing his band's best playing gig of the year. He needed the money. Police thought he would have shown up, if he were able.
None of Walter's friends or band members or family members could verify that in fact, he had left the country or the state or had gone somewhere. So it was our opinion that, that foul play was involved, but here again, we couldn't find anybody.
Police stepped up the investigation of Jim Williams. They learned that just 2 weeks after Walter's disappearance, he was making plans to sell his house and move in with Joanne Notice. Detectives questioned Jim Williams' children. His youngest son, Brett, still lived nearby. He told police he thought it odd when his father ordered a flower box built in the dead of winter at the house he was trying to sell. But the young man told police he had gotten an even more disturbing surprise. One night, shortly after the death of his mother, Brett Williams went out with his fiancée. His father and Joanne Notice came along. Brett was upset to see his mother's favorite bracelet on Joanne's wrist. Jim Williams was getting on with his life at a breakneck pace. Even more suspicious, police learned that right after Walter Notice disappeared, his wife began canceling his singing appearances. It seemed that no one expected Walter to make a return engagement.
Okay, Mr. Williams, I'm just going to ask you a few questions about the night of the 27th.
In the disappearance of Walter Notice, detectives questioned Jim Williams. Where he had been so helpful before, they suddenly found him reticent. When Joanne's turn came, she was still angry over her husband's desertion.
Joanne, during the interview, had made some comments about her and Walter's relationship, that it was not good anymore. that she in fact wanted a divorce. She made the comment that if in fact Walter was gone or dead, that good riddance. So she was not happy with Walter at all. Their relationship was very weak. She wanted out of the marriage, but here again, she did not indicate that she was involved in any way with Walter's disappearance.
Detectives refused to give up the search. They combed Williams' job sites and his property, looking for clues. But Walter Notice was nowhere to be found. It was as if the earth had swallowed him up. In April of 1986, 6 months after Joanne Notice had divorced her husband, she and Jim Williams tied the knot. Neither suspected it would soon become a noose. Then a coincidence sent police down a familiar road, but with a brand new point of view. At the exact spot where Sharon Williams had fatally crashed her car, a second car plowed into the ditch. It landed at precisely the same place as the Williams car, indicating it was going the same speed. But this driver emerged without a scratch. Investigators began to rethink Sharon Williams' death.
The connection between the death of Sharon and the death of Walter was made when one of the officers that was at the scene had called me and asked me if I recalled that accident and who the husband of this woman was. And of course it was Jim Williams.
With no new clues to Walter Notice's disappearance, investigators took a closer look at Sharon Williams' fatal accident. In October of 1986, when Chief Medical Examiner Mary Case studied the accident report, she finally saw what others had missed.
My opinion after reading all of that material was, I think that it is highly inconsistent, this injury that she has, with the accident. I think it's very likely that she had a homicidal assault, blunt trauma to her head, someone beat on her head and caused her to die.
This meant the accident might have been staged, but Case couldn't prove it based on the old report. There wasn't enough to implicate a suspect. By this time, the only concrete evidence lay at the bottom of Sharon Williams' grave. In April of 1987, almost 4 years after Sharon Williams was buried, her remains were exhumed and re-autopsied.
The body was very well preserved, and after the autopsy, I made the diagnosis that her cause of death was the head injury, a massive craniocerebral trauma, and that the manner of death was a homicide.
Dr. Case's suspicions were confirmed. The accident was now a murder, and Jim Williams was the prime suspect. His rush into Joanne Notice's arms further implicated him in Walter Notice's disappearance. But police still needed a body to prove it. Pursuing any lead, they interviewed Jim Williams' oldest son, Jim Jr. Estranged from his father, he was jailed in Florida for armed robbery. But for an early release, he was willing to talk.
Hey, Jimmy, how you doing?
You need to come on out here?
Though detectives refused to deal, Jim dropped hints about a well behind his father's old house. Police hadn't seen a well, but they remembered the large planter. Detectives returned to the suspect's former home. There, they served a search warrant and examined the flower box that Jim Williams had commissioned 4 years earlier. As police dismantled the planter, they broke open the case. The new owners of the house had no idea they also held a mortgage on a burial plot.
We got out there, we brought several investigators with us, and began the task of taking apart a flower box that had been placed over the top of the cistern. Once the lid was removed from the cistern, it was amazing to us that the body of Walter Scott was floating on top of the water.
the body was still clothed in a blue jogging suit. Only now it wore rope restraints and a bullet hole. Dr. Case made a positive identification. The murdered singer had been found. The x-rays revealed the betrayal.
Without even doing an autopsy, you know this is a homicidal death. He didn't bind himself up and get in there and die either from natural, accidental, or suicidal causes. Somebody did this to him.
An autopsy confirmed that the victim had been shot once in the back. Though police had suspected foul play almost from the beginning, forensic science uncovered the entire murderous scheme. Investigators believe that in October of 1983, Jim Williams bludgeoned his wife with a pipe or a crowbar. He then drove her to the country road where he staged the wreck. After he doused the car with gasoline, he started a small fire, hoping to incinerate the evidence. Then he left her for dead, but the rain put a damper on his plan. Though Williams failed to kill his wife with a blow to her head, he finished the job with the stroke of a pen. Only 2 months later, he ambushed Walter Notice. He bound the body and lowered it into the well, successfully hiding it for years. On April 10, 1987, Jim Williams was arrested for murdering both his former wife and Joanne Notice's former husband, Walter Notice. In 1992, Williams was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Joanne Notice got 5 years for hindering the prosecution. Forensic science had given the 2 victims a voice after years of silence. Where the housewife and the singer had been shown no mercy in life, at least in death, they received justice, measure for measure. Detectives know that a cemetery can be an important landmark on the path to the truth. While evidence gleaned there cannot raise the dead, it can sometimes grant peace of mind to those who are left behind. The scene of a murder usually yields a wealth of clues. When properly studied, they can point to a killer. Unfortunately, it's possible for a victim to take crucial evidence to the grave. Then it's up to forensic science to resurrect the truth. A quiet suburban home becomes the scene of a gruesome murder. Detectives are left without suspects or motive. Clues to solving it could be anywhere or nowhere. Investigators suspect that a woman's fatal fall was no accident. Now they must prove it step by step. When a murder exposes a family secret and a cast of shady characters, detectives don't know whom to believe. Killers have their own warped reasons for murder. Some kill for love, some seek vengeance, and others hope to line their pockets with blood money. In this case, the names of the victim and her family have been changed. On December 16, 1994, Len Gruber of Oklahoma City came home to spend his lunch hour with his wife, Carla. Christmas was less than 2 weeks away, and there was plenty to do. In an instant, the pleasant lunch he had planned turned into undiluted horror. Carla lay dead between the kitchen and the dining room. She was naked except for a single sock. A pair of pinking shears jutted from her chest.
Oklahoma City Police Department.
Yes, it's an emergency. My wife's been stabbed.
Police processed the scene. From the looks of it, the victim had fought mightily against her attacker. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Though signs of a struggle were found throughout the house, the epicenter seemed to be the kitchen. Drawers were upended, and the killer had apparently tried several weapons before choosing the pinking shears. The countertop bore a fresh knife strike. A broken knife and a bloodied barbecue fork lay on the floor. Detective Bob Bemo of the Oklahoma City Police Department didn't know what to make of such unbridled violence. But he knew where to start.
Both my partner and I realized that we had a heck of a situation, because this was what we could refer to as a whodunit homicide. Although we did immediately suspect the husband.
Len Gruber gave police a statement. Carla and Len were active in their church and married 30 years. Len told police that he had last seen his wife alive that morning. She had taken the day off to do some last-minute Christmas shopping.
Good morning, honey.
Len had planned to come home for lunch and help decorate and wrap gifts.
Yeah.
He left for the office as he normally did, and returned home a few hours later to find his wife dead. He didn't know who could have done this.
He answered all questions and was very deliberate in his answers and very cool and collected, which you consider highly unusual with a spouse after he's found his wife horribly murdered. I would have expected more emotion coming from him, or him to break down or to be crying. This is basically why he became a suspect.
But investigations are driven by facts, not feelings. Gruber's co-workers told police he had been at the office all morning. His wife's estimated time of death indicated that he couldn't have killed her before he left for work, and he passed a polygraph. Len Gruber was off the suspects list, and that meant there were no suspects. Because there were no signs of forced entry, police surmised that the killer might have been someone the victim had known.
Ask you a few questions about your wife.
Police brought Gruber in for questioning,
Normal morning.
hoping that he would provide them with some detail, some clue they may have overlooked that would reveal a possible suspect.
Like I said, I saw her.
Though he knew it was unlikely, Gruber provided the names of people in his prayer group.
Normal morning. I said goodbye at breakfast.
He couldn't think of anyone else his wife might have been in contact
For lunch,
with.
I was going to come home.
The victim kept an immaculate home, so fingerprints were few and far between. Those found at the point of entry belonged to the Grubers or their neighbors, except for a single thumbprint pulled from the storm door. Who it belonged to was anyone's guess. The forensic investigation continued. In the hallway between the bedroom and the kitchen, they examined the carpet and found faint blood stains. To make the blood easier to see, they used a chemical called luminol, which glows upon contact with blood. It revealed that the attack had proceeded from the bedroom door and down the hall. In one spot, the luminol disclosed boot prints. Detectives weren't sure if they were useful or not.
We're ready for you. Officer Jones, come, let's take
The star pattern resembled the tread on the boots that police officers wear. They feared the scene had been contaminated. Detective Bimo had to be sure before he discounted this potential clue.
I had quite a few of our officers at the scene stick their boots up so that we could photograph the bottoms of their boots in order to match it with this print. None of them matched.
The print provided one more piece of evidence against an unknown assailant. Investigators had collected utensils and blood samples from all over the house, hoping to find even more. According to forensic chemist Elaine Taylor, they had no way of telling what might be important.
A lot of times there's a lot of extraneous evidence that may be collected that as time goes by you ultimately find out it had absolutely nothing to do with the crime scene, but it was collected anyway.
The house yielded a large amount of evidence. It would take days to sort it all out. Most compelling was a single drop of blood that didn't seem to belong to the victim. It was collected from a corner of the kitchen, far from where Carla Gruber had fought for her life.
My first impression was there was no way that the victim could ever have made it to that area where the blood on the chair was. I felt very confident of all the blood stains that were collected at the crime scene that was, in my opinion, going to be one of the most important.
Investigators needed to see if this blood matched the victim's blood. They used a process called electrophoresis to separate specific enzymes out of each sample. Certain enzymes vary from person to person. Electrophoresis utilizes an electric current to separate the enzymes for analysis. The sample is placed in a gel and a current is applied, causing the enzymes to move through the gel. Each enzyme moves a certain distinct distance, creating a pattern of bands. If two blood samples create the same pattern, it's probable they came from the same source. In this case, the bands from the victim's blood and the blood from the chair did not match. The blood was not the victim's. Blood samples from the Gruber's friends, relatives, and neighbors were also gathered for testing. No match there either. Investigators were confident that whoever shed this drop had killed the victim. But they still had no idea who that person was. As investigators collected clues to the murder of Carla Gruber, the victim's husband, Len, collected his thoughts.
I think they made the case.
According to Detective Bob Bimo, his recollection helped jog the investigation.
He had remembered a subject by the name of Eric Patton who had worked for him and had done some painting to his residence during the summer months of June and July.
Len had met Patton at the telemarketing firm where he worked. The Grubers knew he had a prison record, but they weren't interested in that. They believed he deserved another chance. They hadn't seen him since he'd finished painting 6 months earlier.
Somebody else that was there yesterday, but it wasn't me.
Patton was called in for questioning.
Night of the crime here at home.
He told police that he had served time in California for minor burglary. He confirmed that he hadn't been to the Gruber's house since the summer. After he left the station, detectives did some checking on him. They learned that he had asked to have his parole moved to Oklahoma so he could be with his family and girlfriend. Detective Bimo contacted his parole officer to check his story.
and I found that he had been involved in several armed robberies where he used a knife and a pair of scissors. The scissors were quick to catch my eye, and my partner and I both felt like that we had something here.
On December 22nd, 6 days after the murder, Carla Gruber was laid to rest. Investigators used the opportunity to look for potential suspects by photographing those attending.
The main reason that you photograph these individuals is to find out if somebody who's been named is there, also somebody that hasn't been named shows up, and you want to know who they are. You never know. It's unusual, but in some cases the suspect has been known to attend the funeral.
This was one of those cases. The suspect, Eric Patton, was there. Len Gruber identified him from photographs taken at the funeral. Because he barely knew the victim, his attendance raised suspicions, but provided no real evidence of guilt. The best proof would likely come from the physical evidence. The Oklahoma City Police Forensics Lab sorted out the items collected from the crime scene. Attention focused on a bloody barbecue fork retrieved from the kitchen. Investigators wondered if the killer's prints were engraved in Carla Gruber's blood. After photographing the fork to document it, technicians shined an alternate light source over it. Prints too faint to be seen in ordinary light can often be revealed through light of a different wavelength. None turned up, but that didn't mean none were there. The next step was treatment with a chemical called diamidobenzidine. It reacts with blood proteins, clinging to them and turning them brownish red. The chemical was applied and then developed, revealing a single, clear print. It matched the print from Eric Patton's previous arrest report. So did the print on the Gruber's storm door.
Who was that?
You Eric Patton?
Yes, sir.
I have a warrant for your arrest. Right here.
Warrant for my arrest for what? I didn't do
Police
anything.
made their arrest.
We're going to take you downtown.
Boots were found that matched the tread pattern photographed at the crime scene. They too belonged to Patton. 2 weeks later, DNA tests proved the blood drop on the kitchen chair was his. That was all they needed.
The significance of the blood at the scene being foreign to the victim, but consistent with the suspect, Mr. Patton, tied him to the crime scene.
The morning that I actually arrived,
Faced with the overwhelming evidence, Eric Patton confessed. He told authorities that he needed money for drugs. He thought he'd find some at the Gruber's house, not expecting anyone to be there. When he saw that Carla Gruber was home, he modified his plan. She invited him in.
Serious problem. I need to borrow some money.
When he asked for money, she went to find some, though she told him she didn't keep any in the house. But Patton was desperate, and he committed a desperate act.
Check your room.
Because of the heinous nature of his crime, Eric Patton received the death penalty. Things often aren't as they first appear. A killer could visit in the guise of a friendly acquaintance, and an accident could turn out to be no accident. On June 7, 1988, paramedics in Tyler, Texas, were called to the home of 66-year-old Betty Lucas.
I think you hit her head on the marble there. Please, hurry
Her son
up.
Stephen reported that she had fallen down the stairs while he was visiting. She had critical head injuries and her vital signs grew weak. Paramedics stabilized her for transport to the hospital.
So, Doc, what's the doc?
There, Betty Lucas's condition continued to worsen. The following day, Stephen Lucas made the difficult decision to have his mother taken off life support.
She's in a deep coma.
Within a few hours,
If
Betty
everyone's on
Lucas
that life
was dead.
support, I'm asking you, is she going to come out of this?
I don't know, Mr. Lucas.
2 days later, the Tyler Police Department received an anonymous call advising them to investigate her death. What looked like an accident, the caller said, might really be a murder. The caller suggested looking more closely at Stephen Lucas. The tip was forwarded to Detective Danny Alexander. Not certain what to make of the information, he began looking into the facts of Betty Lucas's death. He knew that the victim had been well known and well liked.
Betty Lucas was a very wealthy, influential person in this community. Her husband had been the mayor of the city of Tyler at one time. He owned a business here in Tyler, a real estate business that was very successful prior to his death.
The allegation that Betty's son intentionally murdered her seemed preposterous. But police were obliged to follow the lead. The investigation started at the hospital. The treating physician told police that Betty Lucas had died from irreparable brain damage. Her wounds were confined to her head. They seemed inconsistent with the type of fall her son described. Investigators now had to wonder if there was some truth to the anonymous tip. But investigators had lost valuable time. According to Texas law, authorities must be notified about any unnatural death that occurs within 24 hours of admission to a hospital. Betty Lucas's death fell into this category, but her doctor had been unaware of the rule and had released her for burial.
At that point, we were behind in the game. Evidence had been possibly lost or was no longer available to us. And the fact was that within a couple hours of our notification, she was to be buried.
By the time police began their investigation, her body was already gone. Alexander learned from the doctor that Stephen Lucas had acted strangely while his mother was in the hospital. He had been unwilling to provide details about the accident and demanded that she be buried as soon as possible once she was declared dead.
Stephen had not notified Betty's family in South Carolina of her being admitted to the hospital, nor did he notify them that she had died and was buried.
It was time to talk to Stephen Lucas. Investigators met him and his daughter Stephanie at the victim's home to hear their account of the accident. Stephen told them that he and Stephanie had stopped over around dinner time to return Betty's VCR. He said that Betty was angry with him because he didn't want to attend an upcoming charity event. She then accused him of breaking her VCR and demanded it back.
Mom, give me the VCR back. I only borrowed it
Stephen
for one
didn't want
day.
her to carry the heavy machine herself, but she refused his help. After a tug of war at the top of the stairs, she jerked it up and over her shoulder. The next thing Stephen knew, his mother had fallen over the banister and tumbled down the steps.
Are you okay?
Steve indicated that when she hit the staircase that she then began to slide down this staircase, her head bouncing on each step as she went down. And that when she had reached the bottom of the staircase, she was in the foyer area, that she sat up briefly and then fell back, hitting her head one last time on the last stair of the staircase.
Is she okay?
Stevens said that he immediately ran to the bottom of the stairs and moved his mother's head from the bottom step to the marble floor.
Go get help, Steph. Go get
He
help.
then sent
Hurry.
Stephanie to get help from a neighbor while he called an ambulance. Stephanie said she saw her father and grandmother fighting, but because they always squabbled, she wasn't alarmed. The detective didn't get much more information out of the young woman.
And she was yelling and
When you ask her about any questions and tried to pin her down into a specific story, she would be very evasive and finally would say, "I'm not sure."
The next thing I knew,
Stephen was asked to walk through the scene and recreate what had happened. When he and Stephanie were asked separately where Betty was standing before the fall, they identified locations at least 20 feet apart. Police found no evidence of a struggle at either point. There was another puzzling detail. A neighbor told police that Stephen Lucas and his daughter Stephanie didn't accompany Betty to the hospital immediately after the accident. Instead, they had stayed behind to clean the blood off the floor. Not only was it odd behavior for worried family members, it eliminated a vital source of evidence. After questioning the witnesses and examining the scene, police still had no clear idea how the victim fell. They had no way of corroborating the Lucases' vague stories or any way of proving that they were lying. A lot of unanswered questions were buried along with Betty Lucas. With every passing day, the body of Betty Lucas would have less and less information to divulge. If police were going to get to the bottom of this case, they'd need to get to the bottom of her grave. Investigators hoped that an examination of the victim's remains would clear up some of the discrepancies between Lucas's account and the suspicions that swirled around him. A week after her death, a court ordered Betty Lucas exhumed for autopsy. The autopsy began with a visual inspection. In serious falls, one normally sees large contusions, scraped skin, and most notably, broken bones, especially in a 66-year-old woman. But X-rays turned up no broken bones or dislocated joints. Pathologist Virgil Gonzalez could find no indication of a fall.
And if she hit the stair, there will be a grazing type of abrasion on the skin because of the carpet, a burned skin. But there's no scraping or a grazing type of injuries in any part of Mrs. Lucas' body. The injuries were all confined to the head and the scalp.
Gonzalez discovered a major discrepancy in Stephen Lucas's account. Shaving revealed 7 clean-cut lacerations on the top of her head. If, as Stephen said, she'd received her wounds by sliding down the stairs, only the back of her head would have been injured. From these 7 lacerations, Gonzalez could draw only one conclusion.
Betty Lucas is not an accidental death. It's a homicide.
No matching weapon was found, but investigators were certain that Betty Lucas's wounds could not have come from a fall. After the autopsy, police spoke with Stephanie a second time. Her comments made it clear that she didn't see the fatal fall and wasn't directly involved. Based on the autopsy findings and the family's inconsistent stories, the police classified Betty Lucas's death a homicide, and Stephen Lucas was their main suspect. Investigators returned to the home of Betty Lucas to build their case.
Good shots in this area.
They didn't have a lot to go on. There were no signs of damage on or near the second floor banister, where the struggle had supposedly occurred.
Try to get as many as you can.
Investigators could find no clues to trace the victim's trajectory down the stairs. No evidence was found at the top of the stairs, but the staircase was hardly pristine. Midway up the stairs, investigators found gouges, dents, and scrapes to the wall and molding. A painting was pulled away from the wall, as if someone had clung to it for balance. Sharp cuts marked the banister.
Here, if you would, go ahead.
The victim's maid confirmed that the damage was fresh.
You would take a couple more.
Blood was found on the balusters at the base of the stairs. Investigators had found a spot that Stephen and Stephanie's cleaning had missed.
In that area, we also found very small amounts of blood, which would indicate to us that at some point Betty Lucas's head had rested on that step, or something had happened to get blood in that area.
As the investigation progressed, police searched for motive. Investigators learned that Stephen and Betty's relationship had soured after Stephen failed to repay her a $350,000 loan. Things had recently gone from bad to worse when she refused to give him another $50,000. With Betty dead, Stephen's debt would be relieved, and he stood to inherit even more money from her estate.
She controlled the money in the family, and he was in financial trouble and needed that money, and a lot of arguments, especially right before her death, centered around him wanting to borrow money, get more money from her.
On November 10th, 1988, armed with a motive and forensics that seemed to disprove Stephen Lucas's account, police arrested him. Lucas stood trial in May, but after 6 weeks in court and 22 hours of deliberation, it ended in a hung jury. When polled, the jurors said they weren't convinced by the forensics. The investigators had to start over. The first trial of Stephen Lucas ended in a hung jury. The weight of the evidence had failed to tip the scales toward either accident or murder. If the prosecution had any hope of convicting Stephen Lucas in the murder of his mother, Betty, they needed to strengthen and clarify their forensics case. The state hired Alan Weckerling, a specialist in accident reconstruction, to review the evidence. By now, years had passed since Betty Lucas's death. Her home had been sold and the staircase repaired. But a few items from the crime scene had been saved.
The evidence we were interested in looking at was the molding on the stairwell and the railing on the stairwell, to see if the VCR had actually flown down the stairwell and hit the railing and then ricocheted off of the wall.
Weckerling began by testing Stephen's assertion that his mother had fallen from the head of the stairs. A series of deep gouges marked the top of the wooden molding. Weckerling had to confirm that these were caused by the tumbling VCR. The molding and VCR were examined under a microscope. Paint marks on the VCR matched the molding, proving that it was the source of the damage. But as he studied the molding, Weckerling made a crucial discovery.
I was able to look at the wood under the microscope, and based on really some very simple scientific principles of when you're roller painting a wall and you get the little drips of paint, gravity is going to pull those down.
The paint drips proved that until now the molding had been analyzed upside down. The damage was actually on its underside and could not have come from a falling VCR, as Stephen had asserted. These cuts were made with an intentional upward stroke, damaging the molding from below and undermining Stephen's story about his mother's accidental fall. The next step was to refute the defense assertion that Betty Lucas could have tumbled over the banister and down the stairs. The defense in the first trial used a series of complex calculations to create a computer animation similar to this one, demonstrating Stephen's account of his mother's fall. The prosecution hired physicist Mike Andrews to take a closer look at the animation and defense calculations. He found that the trajectory they presented was physically impossible.
What you should see is that she would just start going over the rail and just go down and land below. What we found was that the initial step, she would go through the banister instead of over the top of it. Then she would come back through, and then she would do a little loop, and then she would go back through it again and then fall down below.
Andrews had the house measured again and used these measurements to disprove the defense scenario. Betty Lucas could not have fallen from the top of the staircase, as her son Stephen had said. Police surmised that Betty Lucas had an argument with her son midway up the stairs. They struggled, creating the damage to the molding and the staircase. Betty fell, and Stephen Lucas beat her near death with an unknown weapon. Lucas stood trial again. This time, the forensic evidence proved that Betty Lucas could not have fallen accidentally. Impeccable detective work had kept a wily killer from getting away with a nearly perfect murder.
There was no eyewitnesses, only the suspect and the victim. Had it not been for the evidence uncovered by the use of forensic science, Steve would have walked away.
Stephen Lucas's plan was complete when he authorized the hospital to take his mother off life support. Stephen was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 35 years. Stephen Lucas tried to get away with murder by making his mother's death look like an accident. Others aren't so thorough in hiding their crime. In this case, the names of the victim and her family have been changed. In the early morning hours of February 19, 1988, a motorist in Lincoln, Nebraska, came across what looked like a one-car accident. Inside, the victim, a woman, was dead, apparently from a head injury. Lancaster County Sheriff's Department, along with the coroner's office, arrived on the scene. They could tell the situation wasn't as it appeared to be. Though the victim had suffered severe injuries, damage to the car was minimal. There were no skid marks. The gear was in park. The car keys were missing, and so was the victim's ID. And the driver's side door had a fresh puncture mark. The scene bore every indication that this was no accident. Sergeant Larry Russell led the investigation.
The injuries were not that type of an injury that would be in comparison to a traffic fatality that you would normally see, the trauma. In looking at the individual closer, it was actually found to be bullet holes, that some sort of projectile that had gone into the head area.
The search of the area surrounding the crime scene found no gun or other apparent clues. In fact, all that was found was a pack of cigarettes, torn open from the bottom, and 2 pairs of house slippers, a men's pair and a women's pair. They were collected, though they didn't seem relevant. Based on the vehicle registration, the Sheriff's Department tentatively identified the victim as Jane Leary, age 25. Her ID was confirmed at autopsy, where her fingerprints were taken and checked against police records. She had a prior record from another state. The autopsy also confirmed that she was killed by 2 gunshot wounds to the head. She had no other injuries.
Here's some coffee.
Investigators contacted the victim's husband. He was brought in for questioning.
Talk to you about last night. Now, you state
Jack
you
Leary
know
didn't
your
seem
wife
terribly
left the house?
surprised by the news.
No. Last night with your wife.
Police asked him to recount the events of the day before.
You didn't know she was gone? Why don't you ever clean up around here?
Leary told police that he and Jane had been fighting. Nothing serious, just a typical domestic quarrel. As usual, Jane took the kids to her mother's and then went off. He really didn't worry about her. A few hours later, 2 acquaintances of the victim showed up at the Leary home. Herman Buckman and his girlfriend, Goldie Fisher.
Jack, I don't believe you.
Leary admitted to
We had a
police
big
that
fight.
Jane sold drugs.
We
He
had a
said
big
that Buckman
fight.
and Fisher came there to trade a
And she
handgun
walked out
for
with
some.
the kids.
When he
And
told
then,
the couple that his wife wasn't home,
couple
they left to
friends
go
of mine
find
came
her.
over.
Leary suspected they murdered his wife.
With your wife.
That wasn't how it
Was that
sounded
normal?
to
She
Detective
got in the
Russell.
middle of the night for no apparent reason.
My first initial impression is that the husband definitely knew more than he was telling. It just didn't seem likely that, gosh, you arrive at a individual's house and you say, hey, your wife has just been shot. And the guy comes up with, well, oh yeah, there were some people here the night before and they were wanting to sell a gun for drugs, and it just didn't seem real believable initially, primarily because of his demeanor.
While Jack Leary was giving his statement, his wife's car was being scoured for clues. Investigators found little more than cigarette butts. They managed to lift some latent prints, but the ones that could be read matched only the victim. Cigarette butts in the car were sent to the lab for analysis to see if they might reveal some clue. A test called immunoglobulin allotyping was performed on the traces of saliva on the filter. The test analyzes the presence of specific proteins found in body fluids. These proteins are genetic markers that vary to a certain degree from individual to individual. According to serologist Rena Roy, formerly of the Nebraska State Patrol Laboratory, the results weeded out most of the population, but indicated that whoever smoked the cigarettes was most likely African American.
95% of the African American population was excluded as being the donor of the saliva on the cigarette butt, as well as 99.3% of the Caucasian population.
The results suggested that the victim, a Caucasian, wasn't the one who smoked the cigarettes found at the scene. The murderer possibly had. Police were now looking for an African-American suspect. Jack Leary was off the suspects list. With no other leads, detectives had to follow Jack Leary's improbable story. They ran a check on Herman Buckman and Goldie Fisher. Both had prior records for narcotics, burglary, and assault. They called Buckman in for an interview. He wasn't the most cooperative of subjects. He said he didn't need an attorney.
When Herman came into the room, I initially read him his rights. He pretty much told me to go pound sand. I'm not going to tell you anything. I wasn't there. A few other words were said, and he then asked for a cigarette.
Buckman refused the deputy's cigarette and said he only smoked a certain brand.
Mr. Buckman, we'd like to ask you some questions, as you may be aware. Understand?
A pack was brought to him.
Here you go, Mr. Buckman.
He opened it from the bottom. It was a habit he picked up in prison to keep the filters clean.
You know, it's like a light bulb came on. I've seen this cigarette pack before somewhere, and then, of course, at the crime scene, there was a cigarette pack with the same type of tear.
Ask questions.
The interview concluded, and Buckman left, and left behind 2 cigarette butts. They were collected and sent to the lab to see if the saliva from the filters matched the saliva from the ones collected from the murder scene. The same immunoglobulin allotype test was performed on these filters. Then the results were compared. The genetic markers on the filters from the car and from the ones Buckman left at the station matched closely.
Looking at the results, we could conclude that Mr. Buckman could have been the donor of the saliva on this cigarette butt.
The characteristics of the saliva were common to 5% of the African American population. The margin of error was too wide. Also, the cigarette only proved that the smoker had recently been in the victim's car. It didn't prove he was the killer. The cigarette butts could have been in the car for weeks. Investigators reviewed everything they had on Buckman, trying to find holes in his story.
Right here.
He had told detectives that he spent the whole night with his girlfriend, Goldie Fisher. In her interview, Goldie Fisher told police that on the night of the murder, she was out with friends and went to see her mother.
When's the last time you saw her?
She confirmed that Herman Buckman was with her the whole time. To check her alibi, investigators paid a visit to Goldie Fisher's mother.
A few questions we'd like to ask you.
She didn't know about the crime or that her daughter might be under suspicion.
We just have some questions about your daughter. Goldie Fisher.
She told police that Goldie hadn't been to see her in at least 4 days. But Jane Leary's murder occurred only 1 day earlier.
Well, thank you for having us in your home.
Goldie's alibi was starting to tarnish. In Lincoln, Nebraska, the investigation into the murder of Jane Leary led detectives to the bar that suspects Herman Buckman and Goldie Fisher frequented. Some patrons said they saw the couple there on the night of the murder. Buckman had a gun with him.
You know, is there anything unusual?
Detective Russell learned something else about the pair as well.
One of the things that Herman Buckman and Goldie Fisher did is they would dress rather nicely going out for the evening, but they had a very unusual thing. They both wore house slippers, which isn't common in my estimations to go out in house slippers.
The slippers found at the crime scene, once thought to be insignificant, now were more closely analyzed. Droplets of blood were found on them. The blood matched the victim's. That linked the slippers to the victim, but not necessarily to the suspects. Investigators needed something more solid. As news of the crime spread, a potential witness surfaced. She realized she'd been near the murder scene shortly after the crime occurred. She'd picked up a hitchhiker. It was around 2 a.m. on the day of the murder. The woman she picked up was acting very strangely. She had no shoes on and seemed to be in a hurry. The driver dropped her off at a nearby neighborhood, Goldie Fisher's neighborhood. The witness picked out Fisher's picture from a photo lineup. That placed Fisher at the crime scene, where she had also apparently lost her slippers and her alibi. Investigators now had enough to arrest Fisher and Buckman for suspicion of murder. With both of their suspects in custody, it was a matter of securing the case against them. Investigators set out to find evidence that placed Fisher and Buckman at the scene. When Buckman's car was searched, ski masks, a crowbar, and other burglary tools were found in the trunk, but nothing that matched the murder weapon. A search warrant also allowed investigators to collect the clothes the victim's husband described the couple as wearing the night of the murder. Traces of blood were found on the lining of Buckman's jacket and on his sweater. It was the victim's blood. With all the pieces in place, investigators were able to surmise the events leading up to the death of Jane Leary. Buckman and Fisher knew where Jane usually sold her drugs. They caught up with her, hoping to trade their gun for some dope. When she refused, they killed her for her drugs and whatever cash she had. Then they pushed the car into the ditch. In addition to receiving 20 to 60 years for firearm possession, Herman Buckman was sentenced to life. Goldie Fisher, charged with robbery and accessory to murder, received 15 to 30 years. Homicide is the ultimate selfish act. Solving it is just the opposite. Only through the close interaction of scientists and investigators can murderers be caught and justice served. In small-town Maine, police pursue the killer of a young mother for 20 years, waiting for technology to match their perseverance. A student disappears on his way to class.
Bye.
A ransom is demanded. Is it a kidnapping, con game, or something far more sinister? Detectives in Washington state must find a way to outsmart a killer who knows their every move before he slips through their fingers. Murders of passion can often lead investigators straight to a killer. But when the clues are few and the leads tenuous, detectives know they are searching for something emotionless. A killer who is cold-blooded. Norridgewock, Maine, November 23, 1976. Police discover a car in the bushes near River Road. The engine still running. There was no one in sight. The officer called in the license plate number. The dispatcher said the car had been reported missing by the owner, Vaughn Stevens. Stevens claimed that his girlfriend had borrowed the car earlier in the evening to do some shopping, but had not returned. Inside the vehicle, the officer discovered blood on the passenger seat. Vaughn Stevens was contacted and asked to respond to the scene. The officer continued to examine the vehicle. Inside the trunk, partially covered by a jacket, he discovered the body of a woman. She was wearing only a pair of socks. Homicide investigations in rural areas fall to the state police. After being notified, investigators began to scour the area for clues. When Vaughn Stevens arrived with a friend, he positively identified his car. His friend had to identify the victim in the trunk. She was Stevens' girlfriend, 30-year-old Janet Baxter. Distraught, Stevens was allowed to leave the scene. Maine State Police Detective Chick Love continued his investigation.
In the car, we found the groceries that she had purchased at the store that night. We found the sales slip, the cash register tape that told us what store she was in and exactly what time that she was there.
The coroner's autopsy revealed Janet Baxter had been shot in the head and chest with bullets from a .22 caliber handgun. She had also been raped. Biological evidence from her body was preserved for testing on glass slides known as slide mailers. The bullets and slide mailers were sent to the crime lab for further analysis. The car Janet had been driving also underwent a thorough investigation. Forensics experts dusted the exterior and discovered a set of latent fingerprints. In the trunk, a single hair was retrieved. Later examination showed it did not belong to Baxter. Hoping to find witnesses, detectives began canvassing the area near River Road. One resident, Clarice Merrill, said she had seen something odd the night before. While driving home, Merrill saw two vehicles pull off the road at the same location where Janet Baxter's body was later found. One of the cars was a yellow Volkswagen. Merrill believed the other car was a Ford LTD. Inside, she saw a man and a woman. The woman appeared to be asleep. Merrill helped create a composite drawing of the man in the LTD, while police began making efforts to locate the yellow bug. In most murder cases, spouses and significant others are always considered suspects. The victim's boyfriend, Vaughn Stevens, was questioned in depth the next day. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He told police that Janet Baxter worked as a nurse and had recently been through a bitter divorce. She had custody of her daughter, Julie.
Let me help you with that. You got that?
Around 9:30, Janet decided to go to the store. Stevens' car was blocking the driveway. He gave her his keys.
All right.
Janet said she would be back in a few minutes.
Around midnight, she didn't show up.
When she failed to return, he phoned police. The polygraph test indicated Stevens was telling the truth. Detectives also questioned Baxter's ex-husband,
We're investigating a homicide that happened on November 29th.
but he had a solid alibi, and like Stevens, he was dismissed as a suspect.
I was working that evening.
Investigators continued searching the area for a yellow Volkswagen.
Can I help you? Good evening. I'm Detective Chick Love. I'd like to ask you a few questions.
A local resident, Galen Lessard, owned a similar car.
I'm not involved in this.
When questioned, he was uncooperative and refused to be interviewed.
you got the wrong person. You need to see someone else. Okay, bye.
Investigators probed Lessard's background. Though nothing in his records indicated he was capable of murder, investigators learned he was friends with other men in town. Their records told a different story. One was a suspect in the murder of a college co-ed 5 years earlier. Another slightly resembled the composite drawing Merrill had helped police assemble. But none of these men would talk to authorities. The investigation threatened to turn cold. On November 28th, almost a week since the murder, an officer noticed a white sedan parked at exactly the same spot where Janet Baxter's body was found. A man was standing outside the car. He appeared to be looking for something. The officer noted the registration and passed it along. Investigators ran a check on the plates and learned the car belonged to a man named Albert Cochran. A background check revealed that Cochran had done prison time in Illinois after pleading guilty to murdering his wife in 1964.
Any different?
Despite a sentence of 50 to 75 years, he was paroled after 12 years. In early 1976, his parole was transferred to the same town in Maine where Janet Baxter lived. Cochran was brought in for questioning.
You observed that crime scene last night?
He claimed that on the night of the murder, he was smoking marijuana and drinking with 3 strangers in the parking lot of a local bar.
On my way back.
They invited him to a party, but he didn't want to leave his car near the bar, so he moved it to a supermarket parking lot. The same one Janet Baxter had visited the night she was murdered. Cochran said he got in the stranger's car, but made them pull over and let him out when he became suspicious of them. He claimed he then walked several miles to his brother's home in Norridgewock. On the way, he stated he saw police gathered at an area off of River Road.
Your hair, if you don't mind looking that over.
Though he refused to take a polygraph, investigators obtained fingerprints and samples of his hair for comparison with previously gathered evidence.
Just relax.
Cochran's fingerprints were examined and compared to those lifted from the exterior of the car in which Baxter was found. His hair sample was compared against the hair found in the car's trunk. Neither the prints nor the hair samples produced a match. There was no hard evidence pointing to Cochran as the murderer. The investigation hit an impasse. For the next 20 years, the case was passed down through dozens of detectives, each one running into the brick wall presented by the lack of hard evidence. It seemed Janet Baxter's death would never be solved. But her family refused to let it go. "20 years had passed since the murder of 30-year-old Janet Baxter in the small New England town of Norridgewock, Maine. During those years, no arrests had been made. Robert McCleary, Janet Baxter's father, was determined to keep the case alive, no matter how long it took to solve. Every year on the anniversary of his daughter's death, he would call police headquarters.
My desire to continue my contact with the state police was deeply motivated by my desire to see that somebody paid for what they had done to Jan. That somebody was not going to get away with murder, and that to continue to seek the information, to continue the investigation, and to give us some sense of closure.
In 1996, the case was handed over to Maine State Police Detective Mike Mitchell. After reviewing the case files, Mitchell paid a visit to Janet Baxter's parents.
Detective Mike Mitchell.
How do you do?
State Police. He's here to
The
say
detective
some
had
things
grown up near Norridgewock and had been in elementary school when the murder occurred.
Well, Mr. McClary, Mrs. McClary, I'm a detective with the Maine State Police, and I just want
He promised he would do everything in his power to solve this case.
If you have any questions of me, don't hesitate to call.
Mitchell began by retracing the steps of the previous investigations. He was struck by the loose ends presented by the owner of the yellow Volkswagen, Galen Lassard, and his cronies, who refused to talk to police. Despite those unresolved issues, he decided to take another crack at Albert Cochran.
Some detectives felt that Albert Patrick Cochran was a suspect and was the person responsible for the murder of Janet Baxter. Some detectives felt that it was another group of people that socialized together. So what I did is I took down all the names of all possible suspects that hadn't been alibied, not to have been in the area at the time, and listed them all down on a piece of paper, and by priority as to who looked like a better suspect than the others. And Albert Patrick Cochran was on the top of the list.
To make his case, Mitchell first had to inventory what evidence had survived over the years. He contacted Maine State Police forensic chemist Chris Montagna.
My other two roles were to see what was still around as far as evidence that had survived 20 years, and second, to reconstruct the notes and the work that had been done 20 years earlier and try and piece all of that together and link it to a suspect that Detective Mitchell was working on as the murderer of Janet Baxter.
Let's see what we've got. We've got the Volvo.
Searching through the boxes of evidence, investigators found the original slide mailers. One looked blank, but was thought to possibly contain swabs of biological evidence from the victim's body. If the evidence had remained intact, it might be possible to extract DNA, a technique not in existence 20 years before. Under the microscope, the slides surprised everyone, revealing the presence of biological evidence removed from Janet Baxter.
So both of them have last name. This one. Oh wow, I see him. Now the number of.
Now, investigators needed to find a DNA sample from Cochran. They did not have to go far to find what they needed. The sample of Cochran's hair collected in 1976 was also preserved in the file. But would the hair have viable material for DNA testing? Forensic DNA specialist David Munich was given the assignment.
These head hair samples were known head hair samples. When they're collected, they're actually plucked from the head, and they have skin attached to the hair root, as opposed to hairs that are cut or hairs that just naturally fall out of your head.
Both samples provided ample material to perform the DNA tests. When the tests were concluded and the comparisons made, the results were overwhelming. The DNA tests showed there was only one chance in 37 billion that Janet Baxter's killer was somebody other than Albert Cochran. Munich called Detective Mitchell with the news.
When it came back a perfect match, I can remember I was driving down the road, I picked up my car phone, and I just couldn't believe it. My eyes filled up with water thinking that it was, you know, something you'll never forget.
Any idea of the date of birth?
It's going to be in March. I'm going to think March 17th, 1938, maybe. He's about 62 years old. Is this something?
But where was Albert Cochran?
What's the last name?
Cochran. C-O-C-H-R-A-N.
Computer checks tracked him down to an address in Stuart, Florida. On the morning of March 17, 1998, Detective Mitchell and Florida police arrested Cochran at his home. He was extradited to Maine to stand trial for the murder of Janet Baxter. Based on the evidence gathered over 21 years earlier, detectives believe Cochran had seen Janet Baxter alone in a deserted grocery store parking lot. His prior history of violence reasserting itself, Cochran seized the opportunity to abduct his victim, later raping and killing her. On May 20th, 1999, it took a jury only 2.5 hours to find Albert Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, this time without the possibility of parole. Murder is not the only cold-blooded crime. In South Dakota, a mother's only son is held for ransom. Aberdeen, South Dakota, May 8, 1985. 20-year-old Michael Kinney left the home he shared with his mother, Sandra McNeil, to attend classes at Northern State College.
Yeah, I've been working hard on it. All right, I'll be back.
Okay.
Bye.
When Michael didn't return by the following morning, his mother became concerned. She decided to look for her son. Near the house, she found Michael's car parked on the side of the road. Michael was nowhere in sight. Sandra McNeil contacted the sheriff's office. Brown County Sheriff Mark Milbrandt was assigned to look into the disappearance.
We had some concerns due to the fact that Michael Kinney's car was found across the roadway from his residence and had been parked there for, we're assuming, anywhere from 24 to probably 35 hours, 36.
The following day, Sandra McNeil received a mysterious phone call from an unidentified man. The caller told her to go to a bar in Aberdeen later that evening and look for an envelope under the payphone if she wanted to find out what happened to her son. She was told not to contact the police. Kinney's mother went to the bar and found an envelope hidden beneath the payphone. Inside was a ransom note demanding $200,000 in exchange for her son. Despite the kidnapper's warning, Sandra McNeil gave the note to sheriff's investigators, who examined it for clues. South Dakota Department of Criminal Investigations agent Doug Lake was brought in to assist with the investigation. His first priority was to deal with the difficulties of obtaining the money.
The ransom money was the victim's mother's money, and it was on Friday after the bank is closed, and the agents, the investigators, went around to the different banks in town and gathered up all the cash that they had on hand.
Go ahead. 3 days after her son disappeared, Kinney's mother received a second phone call.
Hello?
This time, investigators were listening.
Is my son okay?
Sandra McNeil was instructed to leave the money in Aberdeen Park at 9 p.m. Investigators traced the call to a public phone box, but the kidnapper hung up and disappeared before the police could close in. The phone had been wiped clean of prints.
Okay, Melgar Park. Just a minute. My car, right? It's fine. Can I talk to it? Until I get to mine.
Investigators studied the tape. The caller stated Michael was not hurt, but refused to allow him to talk to his mother until the ransom was paid. The kidnapper described Michael's clothing to authenticate his threat. Investigators felt they had no choice but to follow the kidnapper's demands. The money for the ransom was bundled and placed into a briefcase. Investigators also placed a hidden tracking device inside. An undercover female police officer made the ransom drop as scheduled. A short while later, the briefcase was retrieved by a man who then ran off with more than he bargained for. Police quickly followed. The suspect drove to a residence where he parked the blue Oldsmobile he was driving, transferred the briefcase containing the ransom money to an orange Camaro, and was joined by an unidentified female from inside the residence. Led by the tracking device, agents followed the suspects across the Minnesota border. Just inside Minnesota, a roadblock halted the suspects' flight. They were ordered out of their car and arrested. The driver was identified as 19-year-old Todd Miller. The passenger was his 17-year-old sister. Agents retrieved the briefcase from the Camaro's trunk.
We got something here.
The car was closely examined for clues, but there was no sign of Michael Kinney or any other leads to his whereabouts.
The money.
I'm telling you the truth.
Investigators questioned the suspect separately. After a thorough interrogation, investigators found that Miller's sister genuinely appeared to have no clue about Kinney's disappearance or the ransom money. She was released. Todd Miller told police a drug dealer named Bob Jacobs had asked him to pick up a package and deliver it to him in Minnesota. Miller claimed that in return, Jacobs had promised to help him financially. When asked if he knew Kinney, Miller said he was a good friend, but he had no idea Jacobs' job was in any way related to Kinney's disappearance. Miller's story provided investigators with an opportunity. They would use him in a sting operation to nab the drug dealer. The ransom money was returned to him, and he was transported to the pre-arranged delivery point. Jacobs never appeared. Detectives brought Miller back to the police station. The following day, Miller admitted that Jacobs' story was a lie. The kidnapping had been a hoax. Claiming it was all Michael Kinney's idea, Miller explained he had helped stage the entire plot. Miller said he had been friends with Kinney since high school. Alleging Kinney dabbled in various drugs and wanted to move to Canada, Miller stated he was recruited into the kidnapping scam as a way to help Kinney finance his planned relocation. Detectives put Miller through an extensive polygraph test.
Did you harm Michael?
The results of the test were inconclusive, but tended to show the overall truthfulness of his statements.
Todd Miller?
That meant Michael Kinney was alive and on the run. A warrant was issued for his arrest.
Do you live at
Police in South Dakota continued their search for 20-year-old Michael Kinney. What had initially appeared to be a kidnapping was now starting to look like a deception.
Have anything to do with the disappearance?
Kinney's friend, Todd Miller, claimed to be a reluctant participant in helping Michael Kinney stage his own disappearance and extort his mother.
As well as a swell rep.
As the result of Miller's story, a warrant was issued for Kinney's arrest,
This is where
but his whereabouts remained a mystery. Detectives questioned Kinney's girlfriend. She told them she was with Michael the night before he was reported missing. He had dropped her off at her house after they had been out for a pizza and soda. She had not seen or heard from him since. Weeks later, an Aberdeen farmer made a startling discovery. After noticing a foul odor coming from an unused ice house on his property, he entered the building. There, he found a body. Police were immediately called to the scene. Though the body was badly decomposed, investigators found evidence of 3 bullet wounds and what appeared to be blunt trauma injuries to the victim's head. The farmer had no idea who the victim was or how the body ended up in the ice house. Through dental matches, police would soon learn the victim's identity. They had found Michael Kinney.
It was a big impact on us. You know, all of a sudden we went from a possible theft by deception warrant to a kidnapping murder, a homicide.
At the autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be a bullet wound to the aorta. Fibers, perhaps from a rug, were collected from the victim's clothing. It was estimated he had been dead for 2 to 3 weeks, possibly from the time of his disappearance. With Michael Kinney dead, the investigation shifted back to Todd Miller. For investigators, it was clear that he was the killer. But now they had to prove it. To determine if he had written the ransom note, he was returned to the police station to provide handwriting samples. While waiting for those results, warrants to search Miller's cars were obtained. Investigators discovered that the blue Oldsmobile Miller used to pick up the ransom money had been recently washed. However, detectives managed to find 2 hairs that had survived the cleaning. Fiber samples from the trunk were also collected. Next, the interior of the trunk was treated with luminol. This process revealed evidence of blood, but the samples were too deteriorated for analysis. The evidence was hand-delivered to State Crime Lab analyst Rex Reese for comparison. Reese compared fibers removed from Kinney's clothing to those removed from the trunk of Miller's vehicle.
There was an association of the fibers that comprise the liner in the trunk and present as loose fibers on the metal part or the base bottom of the trunk itself. These were black rayon synthetic textile fibers that comprise this liner. Present on Mr. Kinney's clothing were a number of these same type of black fibers.
Though the analysis was incriminating, it was only circumstantial. Investigators needed hard evidence that Michael Kinney had been in the trunk of Miller's car. Reese next compared the 2 hairs recovered from the Oldsmobile's trunk with those taken from Kinney's head during autopsy. But Reese could only make a general comparison. The hairs recovered from the trunk were too damaged for a conclusive analysis.
The hairs had been severed at the proximal end or near the scalp by blunt force, so we couldn't see any of the root structures there. But they exhibited human hair characteristics that were most similar to that of Mr. Kinney.
Reese's analysis brought investigators one step closer to making their case. But it still wasn't enough. Experts conducted an extensive examination of Miller's handwriting. The unique characteristics identified in the ransom note matched those from Miller's sample.
Mr. Miller? Yes?
Despite his protests, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Detectives determined that Miller had wanted to help his father get out of financial problems. He turned to the person he called his friend. On the night of May 8, 1985, Michael Kinney dropped off his girlfriend and headed back home. Police theorized that he was flagged down by his friend.
How's it going, Mike? Hey, Todd.
Completely unaware of what was about to befall him,
Hey, Mike.
Kinney was an easy mark for the cold-blooded violence Miller had planned.
What's up with the gun, man?
After striking Kinney's head, Miller loaded him into the trunk of his car and quickly fled the scene. Miller drove to an isolated farm, where he then shot and killed the still unconscious Kinney. To cover his tracks, Miller hid the body in a derelict ice house. He then returned home and coldly set in motion his plans to extort Kinney's mother. At his trial, Todd Miller was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, possession of ransom money, and forgery. He received 2 life terms plus 20 years. In a community near Preston, Washington, another missing persons case was to turn deadly. On September 4th, 1996, Rex and Shirley Wren reported their son, 35-year-old James Brad Wren, missing. They told police that their son's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was known to be violent. The parents told police that 2 months before, Marcel became enraged at their son while the two were working on the house they shared together. Wren left the residence so Marcel could cool off. When Wren returned later that night, Marcel shot him in the leg.
Oh my gosh!
Their son had refused to press charges. The information was enough for police to open a missing persons investigation. A background check revealed that police had been dispatched to Marcel and Wren's residence several times before to settle angry disputes between the two men. On August 10th, a month after the shooting, Wren called 911 to file a formal complaint against Marcel for another incident. He had not been seen since. Assigned to the Major Crimes Unit of the King County Sheriff's Office, Detective Denny Gula headed the investigation to locate the missing man.
The last time he was seen was with a King County police officer. There was a disturbance at his house, and Sergeant Bachmeyer, the patrol supervisor at that time, had contacted him at home and transported him to the Fall City substation.
Gula began by reviewing the responding officer's log of the August 10th incident. Records showed that Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer had taken Wren to a nearby police station, taken a statement, then released him. Hoping for more detailed information, Detective Gula put in phone calls to Sergeant Bachmeyer. While waiting for a response, he continued his investigation. He questioned Wren's neighbors. One, Richard Pettygrove, recalled that the last time he saw Wren was on August 10th. He reported seeing Wren driven away in a police car following a fight between Wren and his roommate, Emmett Marcel.
He's a real angry
Richard described Emmett Marcel as a dangerous and angry person. All of the neighbors felt certain Marcel had something to do with Wren's disappearance.
My business cards.
Detective Gula ran Marcel's name through the law enforcement database. Marcel had recently been put in a Tacoma jail for an unrelated traffic violation.
Check on license plate.
For investigators, it was time to pay a visit to the prime suspect in James Wren's disappearance.
CCU. Okay, thank you.
Police
very
in
much.
King County, Washington searched for 35-year-old James Brad Wren, reported missing by his parents. Wren's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was quickly becoming the prime suspect. Police went to question him in a Tacoma jail, where he sat for unrelated traffic violations.
Is your name Emmett Marcel?
Yes.
Marcel agreed to take a polygraph. He appeared unconcerned and claimed to have no idea about where Wren might be.
Did you or did you not?
On the evening of August 10th, the day Wren was last seen, Emmett claimed he was with a friend in nearby Tukwila, Washington.
You do not know why you...
Though the polygraph strongly indicated he was telling the truth, investigators were unconvinced. They obtained warrants to search Marcel's car. On the floorboard, investigators found a prescription bottle with Wren's name on it. They also found a hammer with a reddish-brown substance on it. In the lab, samples of the reddish-brown flecks on the hammer were tested, but no conclusive results could be reached. The samples were too deteriorated. The case against Marcel seemed to be going nowhere. A search warrant was obtained for Marcel and Wren's residence.
Anything else out of the unusual?
Inside, a suspicious stain on the carpet drew the investigators' attention. Samples of the stain were preserved on swabs. Detectives hoped this was the break they needed.
We're thinking that this is a pretty substantial piece of evidence. We sent it off to the crime lab for processing. And what we find out is that it's bovine or cow's blood.
With no physical evidence tying Marcel to Wren's disappearance, he was eliminated as a suspect. They hoped that Officer Bachmeier, who had taken Wren's statement on August 10th, could shed some light on the disappearance. After several weeks, Bachmeier finally contacted detectives and came in for questioning. He apologized for the delay, saying he was under a lot of pressure, which was recently compounded when his home had been burglarized and set on fire. In fact, he explained that when he responded to the 911 on August 10th, he recognized Wren. Bachmeier was certain Wren was the person he had seen fleeing from his house after it had caught fire. When Wren was brought in to file his complaint, Bachmeier confronted him about the arson. Wren admitted to the crimes. But after writing out his confession, Wren stormed out of the station. For Detective Gula, Bachmeier's story seemed odd.
You know, people just don't storm off and walk out of the police station, especially when this person has just admitted to you to have burned your house down.
Okay, now let's try to...
Though it was unclear if Bachmeier was involved in Wren's disappearance, investigators decided to take a closer look into the arson and burglary at his home. Detective Gula met with the Renton PD arson investigators who had been the first to look into the fire at Bachmeier's house. After first believing the motive behind the fire was possibly an act of revenge by a criminal, they were now convinced Bachmeier had set the fire himself. The arsonist had used flares stuck in plastic containers to start the blaze, a method that would give the perpetrator plenty of time to leave the scene before the fire actually caught. The investigation further revealed numerous valuable items, including jewelry, limited edition prints, CDs, and leather jackets, had been removed from the house prior to the fire and stored in the garage to avoid being damaged. King County Sheriff's Detective Sue Peters also worked the investigation.
Basically, Renton police detectives were concerned and thought Bachmeyer possibly could be a suspect because one of the neighbor ladies had actually seen what she believed was Sergeant Bachmeyer leaving on his motorcycle in the middle of the night, and then several minutes later, his house is on fire.
Due to all of the conflicting circumstances, Bachmeyer's insurance company had refused to pay his claim unless he took a polygraph, something he refused to do. He was stripped of his badge and gun and was suspended from the department. He was now the prime suspect in Wren's disappearance. But police had no motive and no body to suggest a crime had taken place. Investigators would have to outsmart a man who knew how to hide evidence. Police in Washington State were beginning to suspect that fellow officer Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was responsible for the disappearance of 35-year-old James Brad Wren. According to Bachmeyer, Wren had confessed to torching and burglarizing the officer's home just before he disappeared. A copy of Wren's confession to Sergeant Bachmeyer was obtained. Each page bore Wren's signature. The statement and the signatures, however, appeared to be written in a different hand. But it was not unusual for an investigator to write out a story and have a suspect sign it. To be sure, the confession was sent to a handwriting expert. Examiners determined that the signature at the bottom of each page was in Wren's handwriting, while the statement itself was in Bachmeyer's. But the analysis revealed something more interesting. Though the entire statement was written in the same color ink, one type of pen had been used to write the first 2 pages, which pertained to Wren's complaint about Emmett Marcel, but pages 3, 4, and 5 had been written with a different pen. Those pages contained Wren's confession to the arson and burglary. For investigators, a clearer picture was beginning to emerge.
It was my belief that Brad Wren was going to be used as the suspect of the arson, which he was, according to Sergeant Bachmeyer. And, you know, the case is really all tied together, that Sergeant Bachmeyer was becoming the focus of the arson of his own home, and so he needed to find someone that he could say set his house on fire to clear him. So he picked Brad Wren, who led a very simple life.
Search warrants were obtained for the patrol car Sergeant Bachmeyer used on the evening of August 10th. Small reddish-brown stains were found on the back seat and armrest of the patrol car. The rear seat covering was removed. Investigators were shocked to discover a much bigger stain in the foam padding. It appeared a large amount of substance had seeped through the upholstery and into the cushion. Samples of each stain were taken to the crime lab. They all tested positive for human blood. When confronted about the evidence, Bachmeyer stated Wren had experienced a nosebleed while in the patrol car.
You being the one.
Police didn't buy it. Examiners developed experiments to determine how much blood it would take to leave such a large stain under the patrol car's rear seat. By using different amounts of human blood to soak back seats from similar patrol cars, criminalists ascertained the absorption rate of the foam padding and the amount of blood needed to make a similar size stain. They determined that a minimum of 200 milliliters, or nearly a cup of blood, was involved. Far more than even the worst nosebleed would produce. Examiners had to prove that the blood in the patrol car came from Wren. But without a body, there were no samples to compare. It fell to forensic chemist Kim Duddy to find a way around that problem.
Both his biological parents were still alive and were willing to give blood samples. So our DNA unit took the blood samples from both his biological mother and father and tested it to the question stain on the seat from Bachmeier's vehicle.
The DNA analysis showed that the blood from Bachmeier's patrol car had come from the biological child of Rex and Shirley Wren. Even without a body, the evidence was now overwhelming that Sergeant Matt Bachmeier was responsible for the murder of James Wren. The veteran police officer was arrested. If any doubt remained, it was cleared up on February 2nd, 1997, less than 3 months after Bachmeier's arrest. Bone and clothing fragments were found near a secluded cul-de-sac in Cougar Mountain Park. Among the most identifiable pieces were a skull and a red, white, and blue cast. Keys to the gated park were found on Bachmeier's keychain. Police believe that Sergeant Bachmeier's scheme to make some easy cash by setting up a phony arson of his home backfired when his insurance company became suspicious. He needed to prove to them that criminal forces were out to get him. Wren became a patsy in his twisted plan. Sergeant Matt Bachmeier was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Killers who strike without remorse, whose motives are obscure, can frustrate detectives in their efforts to solve a case. But dogged investigation, coupled with patience and the ever-advancing scientific methods of the crime lab, can often produce results, no matter how cold-blooded the crime.